It began like a fever dream, the kind that arrives in twilight, half real, half wonder. A rush of words, gestures, declarations, like poetry recited just for you. "You're different," they said. "You're everything I didn't even know I needed." And your heart, so ready to be seen, opened without hesitation, grateful for the sudden sunlight after so many cloudy days. There were gifts, glances, and good mornings wrapped in stardust. Text messages that never stopped, eyes that never looked away, a presence that felt like a gravitational pull. It felt like fate, like you had stumbled into the center of someone else's dream. And for a moment, you believed it might be yours too. But beneath the golden glow was something hurried, something breathless, as if time were running out and love had to be caught, not cultivated. You weren't getting to know each other. You were being consumed. The words were big, but the silence between them was hollow. The passion was loud, but the listening was quiet. Every day felt like a performance you had to perfect, or else the applause might stop. What seemed like adoration was acceleration, a crash course in attachment designed to keep you dizzy. You mistook the heat for depth, intensity for intimacy, possession for protection, and in loving the way they loved you, you began to forget how to love yourself. Sleep now, gentle soul. You don't need to chase that kind of love again, the kind that burns too fast, too bright, and leaves you shivering in the aftermath. Real love moves more slowly. Real love stays. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The silent treatment. Affection turned cold. There are wounds that bleed, and then there are wounds that echo. The silent treatment is the latter. A silence so loud it hums behind your thoughts, keeping you awake in the dark, wondering what you did wrong. One day, they adored you. The next, they vanished. Not from the room, but from attention, affection, acknowledgement. Their eyes stopped meeting yours. Their words became few, sharp-edged, or absent altogether. You started scanning the silence for clues. Was it something you said? Something you didn't say? You retraced your steps like walking through an invisible crime scene, looking for broken glass when there had only been silence. But here's the truth. The silent treatment is not absence, it's control. It is emotional exile, a quiet punishment that makes you beg for warmth without knowing why you were frozen out. They withhold to make you smaller. And it works. You shrink, you plead, you apologize for things you don't even understand. You begin to perform your love in softer tones, on tiptoe as if your voice might crack the ice. You become careful. Too careful. But love should never feel like exile. It should not leave you outside knocking on a door you didn't close. Dear one, this silence was never your fault. Their withdrawal speaks more of their fear than your failure. Let go of the question that has no answer. You do not need to earn love with suffering. You do not need to beg to be seen. Sleep now. The silence will fade, and you will hear your own voice again. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Gaslighting. When your truth is denied, it doesn't begin with a lie. It begins with doubt. A look that makes you question your tone. A shrug that rewrites an entire evening. They don't accuse, they just deny. Softly, smoothly, like they're doing you a favor by correcting your version of reality. You're overreacting. You're remembering it wrong. You're too emotional. The words aren't loud. They're calm. Too calm. Calm enough to make you feel like the storm is yours alone. So you start to pull back. Just a little at first. You replay conversations in your mind, looking for where you went wrong. You write down things you're afraid you'll forget. You ask friends if it really happened the way you remember. You begin to doubt your own emotional temperature. Was I too sensitive? Did I provoke it? Maybe I did make them angry. Maybe I'm imagining it. That's the cruel magic of gaslighting. It doesn't take your memories by force. It convinces you to give them away. One by one, you start trading pieces of your truth for the illusion of peace. You find yourself apologizing just to stop the tension. Not because you're wrong, but because you're tired. Because it feels easier to surrender than to keep defending your own mind. And somewhere along the way, you forget what it felt like to trust yourself. But here now, in the quiet, I want to remind you, what you felt was real. What you remember matters. You are not unstable, and you are not alone. Your truth is not too loud. It's just been buried under someone else's silence. Sleep now, and as you rest, know that clarity's returning. You are not lost. You are waking. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Walking on eggshells. Loving through fear. There's a silence that isn't quiet. It crackles beneath every word. A stillness so charged that even the softest breath feels like it might set off an alarm. This is what it means to walk on eggshells. To love with your shoulders tense. To speak in softened tones, not because you want peace, but because you fear eruption. You start to measure each word before it leaves your lips. You weigh it against their possible moods, their possible triggers, their possible rage. And in doing so, you begin to vanish. You find yourself constantly watching, not out of admiration, but out of survival. You read their face like weather, predicting storms, preparing shelter even when the skies are blue. You think, if I'm careful enough, if I stay small enough, maybe I won't provoke it this time. But it's never about what you said. It's about the power they hold when you're afraid to speak. So your joy becomes cautious, your opinions muted, your dreams postponed. You shape yourself into the version of you that they are least likely to punish. And slowly, you forget who you were before you became a strategist of silence. But you were not made to tiptoe through love. You were not meant to earn affection by erasing yourself. Dear one, you deserve a love where you can speak freely, move freely, breathe freely. A love where your truth doesn't tremble as it leaves your mouth. Sleep now. Unclench your jaw. Soften your spine. You are safe here. There are no eggshells in dreams. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The hot and cold cycle. A game disguised as love. It begins with warmth, the kind that melts you, the kind that feels like home you never knew you were missing. They pull you close with every word, every touch, every whispered promise of forever. And then, without warning, they vanish. Not always physically, but emotionally. They go distant, detached, indifferent. Your messages go unanswered. Your presence becomes invisible. You wonder, what did I do wrong? You replay every detail, searching for the moment you lost them. You ache to fix it, even if you don't know what it is. And just when your hope begins to crumble, they return, smiling, loving, as if nothing ever happened. As if your sleepless nights and tear-stained pillows were just a misunderstanding. You breathe again. Relief floods your chest like love is medicine you were denied and finally allowed. But this is not love. This is a pattern, a game. The withdrawal was the bait. The return is the reward. And the uncertainty? That's the leash. You begin to crave the warmth, but brace for the frost. You never know which version of them you'll meet. This instability becomes familiar, even addictive. And somewhere deep inside, You start to believe you must earn the warmth by surviving the cold. But dear heart, love should not come with conditions carved in ice. You should not have to prove your worth each time they drift away. This cycle is not affection. It's emotional roulette. And every spin costs you a little more of yourself. Sleep now. You don't need to chase love that disappears only to keep you desperate. Real love doesn't vanish. Real love stays. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Guilt tripping. When love becomes a burden, there's a kind of love that doesn't ask with words. It weighs. A sigh. A pause. A glance filled with unspoken disappointment. Not loud, not obvious, but enough to make your chest tighten and your joy shrink. Guilt tripping is a quiet weapon. It doesn't push. It pulls. It coils around your decisions until you feel wrong for choosing yourself. For saying no. For needing rest. For setting even the smallest boundary. It begins with subtle phrases. I guess I'll just do it myself. Must be nice to not care. After everything I've done for you. And suddenly, love becomes a debt. Affection is no longer given. It's earned through obedience, through silence, through sacrifice. You start doing things not because you want to, but because you don't want to feel bad. You become hyper-aware of their moods, anticipating their disappointment before it's even voiced. Over time, you start saying yes to avoid the heaviness of no. You become the caretaker of their feelings, even at the cost of your own. But guilt is not a currency of love. It is a chain wrapped in apology, tightened by fear. Love should not ask you to betray yourself, to prove your devotion. You are not selfish for having needs. You are not cruel for needing space. You are not ungrateful for wanting peace. Dear soul, you don't need to carry the weight of someone else's happiness on your back. Let the burden fall. Let your breath return without permission. Sleep now. Release the guilt that was never yours. You are allowed to be light again. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Jealousy as a weapon. The love that traps. At first, it felt flattering. They noticed when others looked at you. They called you mine with a smile, wrapped you in arms that felt protective, even possessive. And you mistook the possessiveness for passion. But soon, the gaze sharpened. Questions started creeping in. Who were you texting? Why did you smile at them? Why didn't you answer sooner? And slowly, your world began to shrink. What once felt like attention turned into surveillance. You began explaining your every move, clarifying innocent moments, apologizing for things that didn't need apologies. You stopped dressing the way you liked. Stopped talking to old friends. You learned to preempt suspicion before it surfaced. You became smaller. Not out of guilt, but out of fear of being misunderstood. This was not love. This was captivity wrapped in insecurity. A mirror held up to you not to reflect your beauty, but to remind you that you were being watched. Jealousy used as a weapon is not a sign of care. It is a cage, built from their own wounds and furnished with your silence. They say it's because they love you. But love doesn't isolate. Love doesn't accuse. Love doesn't bruise you with suspicion. You are not unfaithful for being radiant. You are not disloyal for being seen. You are not wrong for being wanted by the world. Dear heart, you don't need to dim your light to make someone else feel safe. Let your brilliance return. Let trust replace the chains. Sleep now. And as you drift, know this. Real love is not afraid of your freedom. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Control in disguise. I know what's best for you. It didn't look like control at first. It looked like care, like someone guiding you, advising you, trying to help you become the best version of yourself. They said they only wanted what was best for you, and at first, you believed them. Because love is supposed to be supportive, isn't it? So when they questioned your choices, you listened. When they doubted your friends, you distanced. When they laughed at your dreams, you adjusted them, just a little, to avoid the ridicule, to keep the peace. But over time, you stopped making decisions without looking for their approval. You stopped trusting yourself. They said it was out of love, that they only wanted to protect you. But protection that asks you to surrender your will is not love. It is a slow erasure, one boundary at a time. They dressed their control in affection. You wouldn't survive without me. You always make the wrong choices. I just know you better than you know yourself. And somehow, you started to believe it. That your instincts couldn't be trusted. That your desires were flawed. That their voice was more important than your own. But dear soul, love does not override your autonomy. It does not mold you into someone else's image. You are not clay to be shaped by someone else's hands. You are the sculptor. You are the dreamer. You are the decision-maker of your own becoming. Let their grip loosen now. Let your voice return. You were never meant to be managed, only cherished. Sleep now. You are free to reclaim your choices. You are safe in the hands of your own wisdom. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Emotional withholding, the starvation diet of love. There is a kind of absence that doesn't leave the room. It just stops reaching for you. You sit beside them, but it feels like a wall has grown where warmth used to be. They're present in body, but not in spirit, not in effort, not in heart. This is emotional withholding, not the loud cruelty of words, but the quiet cruelty of what's missing. At first, you rationalize it. Everyone has off days. Everyone needs space. But the space becomes distance, and the distance becomes routine. They stop asking about your day. They stop noticing your moods. They offer no comfort when your eyes are tired from holding in tears. And when you ask for more, for presence, for reassurance, for tenderness, you're told you're needy, dramatic, demanding. So you adjust. You stop asking. You learn to fill the silence with self-blame. You convince yourself that scraps are enough, that maybe you expect too much. But dear one, love is not a ration. It is not something to be earned by shrinking yourself or swallowing your needs. You should not have to beg for the basics. Not for care, not for affection, not for kindness. When love is withheld, it teaches you to starve politely, to smile through hunger, to thank someone for what they never gave. But you are not here to be half-loved. You are not a vessel to be kept empty for someone else's convenience. You deserve a love that arrives, that sees, that responds. Sleep now. Let go of the longing that kept you awake. You are worthy of a love that nourishes. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The Savior Complex, falling for the broken. They looked fragile when you met them, wounded, haunted by a past they didn't quite share, but hinted at, just enough to stir your empathy. And something inside you stirred, that ancient instinct to heal, to love deeply enough that maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't hurt anymore. You saw their scars and called them beautiful. You saw their chaos and called it misunderstood. You believed, with all your softness, that your love could be their rescue. So you became their anchor, their compass, their therapist, their shelter. But slowly, you stopped being a partner and became a lifeboat. always bailing water from a ship they refused to steady. They thanked you at first, cried in your arms, promised they were trying. But the trying always stopped short of actual change, and each time they slipped, you caught them. Because that's what love does, right? It holds. It forgives. It stays. But here's the quiet truth. It's not your job to save someone who keeps choosing their drowning. You are not selfish for stepping back. You are not cruel for refusing to be consumed by someone else's healing. Love should lift, yes, but not at the cost of your own balance. Not when your needs are always placed second to their sorrow. You cannot fix someone who doesn't want to be whole. You can offer light, but they must choose to walk toward it. Dear soul, you are not a savior. You are a human worthy of mutual care. Sleep now. You are allowed to let go of who you couldn't save. Your healing matters too. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Becoming who they want. The disappearing self. You didn't notice it all at once. It happened in tiny turns, soft compromises, masquerading as closeness. You changed your laugh, just a little. Your opinions, just enough. Your clothes, your habits, the way you answered the phone. You told yourself it was natural, that love means adapting, that blending two lives requires a little give and take. But slowly, you started giving without taking, bending without being met, fading without anyone noticing you were disappearing. They didn't ask you to change, not directly. They just reacted. Subtle disapproval, mocked preferences, quiet withdrawals, until you learned what version of you they approved of. And so you became that version. Polished and pleasing, less messy, less loud, less you. You stopped doing things you loved, stopped saying things you meant, stopped dreaming out loud. All to keep the peace. All to avoid that sinking feeling of being too much. But love that requires your transformation into someone else's idea is not love. It's performance. And performances end when the audience stops clapping. You were never too much. You were just too alive for someone who only wanted what they could control. You do not exist to be sculpted by someone else's comfort. You deserve to be seen in your full color, your full volume, your full truth. Dear one, if you have to shrink to be loved, it is not love. It is disappearance in disguise. Sleep now. And as you rest, may your forgotten self rise again. Bold, honest, unfiltered. You do not need to be edited to be enough. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Shrinking yourself to be loved. There are wounds you cannot see. Not bruises, not scars, but small, invisible foldings of the self. You begin to make yourself smaller, quieter, more palatable, and you call it love. You notice what makes them uncomfortable. You notice what dims their smile. And then, you adjust. Without protest, without acknowledgement. You lower your voice. You temper your joy. You swallow opinions, silence your excitement, and smile when all you want is to scream. Because somewhere along the way, you were taught that being too much means being left. That love is safer when you take up less space. So you begin to disappear by degrees. Not all at once. Just enough to stay close, to be accepted, to avoid the sharp edge of rejection. You say it's fine when it's not. You laugh at jokes that chip away at your spirit. You apologize for taking up time, attention, air. But love should never require your reduction. You are not a shadow meant to orbit their light. You are a sun in your own right. If you must shrink to be held, you will never feel full. If you must soften every edge, you will lose your shape. Dear one, you were not meant to be manageable. You were meant to be magnificent. Let yourself unfold again. Let your voice stretch out like dawn over mountains. Sleep now. No more shrinking. Tonight, the vastness of you is welcome here. You are not too much. You were just with someone who couldn't hold your whole. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Losing your voice in the name of harmony. At first, it felt like wisdom. To choose silence over sparks. To bite your tongue so the night wouldn't turn sour. To let the little things slide because peace was more important than pride. You told yourself it was maturity. That real love meant letting go of the need to be right. And maybe it did. Sometimes. But not always. Not when silence became habit. Not when the words inside you began to rot from holding them in too long. They would speak freely. Their frustrations, their judgments, their discomforts and opinions. And you would absorb it, nodding gently, smiling softly, saying, "It's okay." Even when it wasn't, even when your chest ached with things unsaid. You learned to translate your truth into something palatable. You learned to edit yourself for the sake of balance. But harmony built on suppression is not peace. It's pressure. And pressure, unspoken, eventually breaks. Dear one, your voice is not a threat. Your truth is not unkind. You're not difficult for having boundaries. You are not dramatic for needing to be heard. Love is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of honesty held gently. You don't have to go quiet just to keep someone close. Your voice matters. Not just the sweet parts, but the strong, the vulnerable, the trembling ones too. Sleep now, and may your dreams echo with the sound of you finally speaking freely, softly, fully. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. When you can't say no anymore. There comes a time when the word no feels like a betrayal, not to yourself, but to them. And that is the beginning of forgetting who you are. It didn't begin as fear. It began with compromise, a gentle thing, a giving thing, a soft shrug of the shoulders when they asked something small. And you said yes, because you loved them. But over time, the asks grew larger. And so did the silence inside you where your voice used to be. You began to hesitate before responding, measuring not just what you wanted, but what they expected. No became risky. No became heavy. You didn't want to upset them, didn't want to be the reason they turned cold, withdrew, accused you of not caring. So you softened your refusals into questions. Maybe, if I can. Let me see. And before long, you weren't saying no at all. You were only saying what would keep them near. You gave time when you had none. You gave energy when you were spent. You gave away your needs, your preferences, your peace, just to preserve the illusion of harmony. But love that costs you your truth is a slow betrayal of the self. You are not a bad person for needing to rest. You are not unkind for protecting your energy. Dear one, no is not rejection. It is a boundary, and boundaries are the architecture of freedom. They are the way you say, I matter too. If they only love the parts of you that say yes, they do not love you fully. Tonight, breathe into your right to choose, to pause, to step back. Let the sacred power of no return to your lips, like a forgotten language finally remembered. Sleep now. There is peace in knowing you are allowed to not give everything away. Now let's move on to the next chapter. Confusing sacrifice with devotion. They told you love meant giving, and so you gave. You gave time. You gave patience. You gave second chances dressed as compassion. And you told yourself, this is what devotion looks like. Because love, after all, is unselfish. Isn't that what you learned? that to be good at loving means putting someone else first. So you did. Again and again, you stepped aside from your own needs, your own voice, your own desires, just to make room for theirs. You told yourself it was noble. You told yourself it was right. But somewhere along the way, you stopped noticing the weight of what you were carrying. You forgot that devotion does not mean disappearance, that true love does not require you to shrink. Because there is a difference between sacrifice and surrendering yourself. There is a difference between giving freely and being drained dry. When love becomes a performance, a never-ending effort to prove your worth through how much you can endure, you are no longer loving. You are surviving. You are not meant to be a martyr in your own story. You do not have to give parts of yourself away to be loved. Healthy devotion feels like support, not self-erasure. It is not about bleeding for the bond. Dear one, you are allowed to be full and still be loved. You are allowed to have limits and still be cherished. You are not selfish for wanting a love that nourishes both souls equally. So tonight, as you drift beneath the weight of too many quiet yeses, let yourself rest in the knowing that real devotion includes you too. Sleep, and in your dreams, may you meet a version of love that lets you stay whole. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Apologizing for your needs. At some point, you began to say sorry before you even spoke. Sorry for interrupting. Sorry for needing space. Sorry for being tired or anxious or overwhelmed. You whispered apologies for simply being human. You learned, somehow, that having needs meant being difficult, that voicing your feelings was a burden, that asking for anything meant taking too much. So you made yourself smaller with every sorry, hoping they'd love you more the less you required. But what kind of love asks you to apologize for your longing? What kind of connection only feels safe when you're silent? You started rehearsing your emotions like you were preparing a case. You softened your language, brushed off your pain. I'm fine, you'd say, when you weren't. I don't want to bother you, when your heart was breaking. But dear one, you were never asking for too much. You were only asking for the bare minimum. To be seen, to be heard, to be held without guilt. Needs are not weaknesses. They are not flaws to be hidden or shamed into silence. They are the quiet truths that make you real and reachable and whole. You are not wrong for needing reassurance. You are not a burden for wanting care. The right love doesn't punish your tenderness. It protects it. So tonight, may you release every apology that was never yours to carry. May your needs rise like soft waves in the dark, unashamed and steady. Let your breath remind you, you deserve love that doesn't require you to shrink before you're embraced. Sleep now, and let every breath be a quiet act of self-permission. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. When you stop dreaming because they don't approve. There was a time when your dreams danced like lanterns in the sky of your mind, unapologetic, bright, weightless. You'd imagine futures with color, with music, with versions of you untethered by fear. But then, they questioned it. They laughed at the idea, called it unrealistic, said it was silly. And just like that, a flicker of doubt moved into your heart. You tried to explain. You tried to share the fire in your chest, the visions that kept you up at night. But their eyes didn't light up. They narrowed, dismissed, turned cold. So you tucked the dream away, told yourself maybe it wasn't that important. Maybe it could wait. Maybe it was too much. You began editing your imagination to fit inside their comfort. You stopped talking about what lit you up. You made yourself content with smaller wants, shallower skies. But what happens when you shrink your future to fit someone else's fear? What becomes of the soul that was meant to expand? You weren't made to abandon yourself for approval. The dreams you carried were not a threat. They were a map to your becoming. And love? Real love will never ask you to dim your light so someone else doesn't squint. Tonight, let those forgotten dreams tiptoe back into your room. Let them sit beside you, soft and glowing, as you remember what it felt like to believe in what could be. You do not need permission to want more. Sleep now, and in your dreams, may the lost visions return. Not as ghosts, but as guides showing you the way back to yourself. Now let's move on to the next chapter. Love that demands you change. At first, it felt subtle. A gentle suggestion. A comment about your laugh, the way you dress, your friends, your habits. Nothing too harsh, just suggestions. Wrapped in smiles. Disguised as concern. Whispers that said, I love you, but... And so, you adjusted. You tweaked your sentences, filtered your feelings, put certain dreams on pause. Not because you wanted to, but because you thought. This is what love asks for. They didn't have to force you. They simply made you feel like the real you wasn't quite enough. Soon, you began to scan yourself before they did. You apologized for quirks you once celebrated. You flinched at the thought of being too much or too different. You became a mirror for their preferences instead of a window into your truth. But love that demands you change to be palatable is not love. It's control wearing perfume. Love doesn't mold you into its shape. It marvels at your edges. It doesn't erase your identity for the sake of harmony. It learns to dance with your rhythm. You don't need to edit yourself into someone else's comfort zone. The you who laughs too loudly, who dreams too big, who loves with wild hands. That you is worthy of being chosen as is. So tonight, as you exhale the weight of becoming someone you're not, may you return to the softness of your original self. The version of you that needs no edits, no disclaimers, no permission. Let that version rest now, held, honored, and whole. Now let's move on to the next chapter. Forgetting what joy felt like before them. Once. Before they entered your world, you laughed without hesitation. You danced in your kitchen for no reason. You sang badly, spoke freely, and felt joy like sunlight on bare skin. It was effortless, not something you earned, just something that was. But slowly the colors began to fade. Not all at once, just a little less brightness each day. The things that used to thrill you felt distant. The music you loved began to sound hollow. You smiled, but not from the inside. You told yourself you were just growing up, just busy, just tired. But deep down, you knew. You were becoming someone who had traded joy for peacekeeping, for pleasing, for surviving their moods. Joy, once so abundant, became conditional. It only showed up when they were happy, when things felt safe, when you weren't bracing for the next shift in their tone. You began to associate joy with permission, with approval, with the absence of tension. And slowly, you forgot how to feel it on your own. But dear one, your joy is not a privilege to be granted. It is your birthright. It is not meant to be rationed by someone else's capacity to love you. You deserve to feel alive, even when no one's watching. You deserve to laugh without checking the room. So tonight, may you remember what it felt like to be joyful for no reason at all. Let your dreams gently restore the pieces you thought were lost. The light in you isn't gone. It's just waiting to be welcomed home. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. When you become the parent in the relationship, it didn't happen overnight. It began with little things, reminding them of appointments, managing their emotions, explaining, comforting, fixing. You told yourself, this is love. This is what care looks like. But soon, you weren't their partner anymore. You became their parent. You held the emotional weight of both hearts. When they lashed out, you soothed. When they fell apart, you gathered the pieces. You learned to tiptoe around their storms, to preempt their needs, to protect them even from themselves. And yet, who held you? Who asked, "Are you okay?" Who sat beside your sadness without asking you to shrink it? You became the emotional adult in a one-sided equation. Their healing became your responsibility. Their mistakes, your guilt. Their growth, your unpaid labor. And all the while, your needs waited in the back room. Quiet, patient, forgotten. You began to feel guilty for wanting something for yourself. A day of rest, a moment of quiet, a bit of tenderness that didn't have strings attached. But love is not meant to feel like parenting. It's not meant to drain you into someone else's survival. You are not a savior. You are not a therapist. You are not their mother, nor their crutch, nor their bandage. You deserve a relationship where care is mutual, where both hearts are held, where you don't have to sacrifice your stability for their unpredictability. So tonight, release the roles you were never meant to carry. Let the version of you that's tired of being the strong one finally rest. Sleep deeply, knowing that love should never cost you yourself. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Chasing closure that never comes. You keep looking for the moment where it all makes sense. A final conversation, a clear answer, a full stop at the end of a jagged sentence. You crave it like water. This thing called closure. Maybe if they'd just explain. Maybe if you could just ask one more question. Maybe if they saw the pain they caused, if they acknowledged the weight they left you carrying, then maybe, just maybe, you could move on. But the truth is softer and heavier. Some people will leave without ever telling you why. Some wounds remain open not because you're broken, but because they never had the courage to be honest. You chase closure like a mirage in the desert, thinking it's just a step away, just one more message, one more memory replayed, one more chance to understand. But every time you reach for it, it dissolves. Because closure isn't something they can give you. It's not found in their apology or absence of one. It's born when you stop needing to make sense of senseless things. You will never rewrite their story into something kinder. You cannot force accountability into a silent heart. But you can choose to stop spinning in the loops they left behind. Closure, in its quietest form, is acceptance, not forgiveness, not forgetting. Just the decision to no longer search in places that will not yield peace. Tonight, breathe out the questions that have no answer. Let your soul know it can rest without resolution. Some goodbyes are unfinished, but that doesn't mean you have to stay inside the sentence. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Staying for the good days. You tell yourself, but not all of it was bad. And you're right. There were moments, sweet mornings, laughter in grocery aisles, quiet nights where it felt like home. There were apologies, genuine or not, and soft hands that held you like they meant it. So you stay. Because the good days are just enough to keep you hoping for more of them. You wait for their warmth to return like spring, ignoring the frost that bites you in between. You learn to survive on breadcrumbs, to treasure the times when they look at you with softness, when they say what you've longed to hear, when, for a fleeting moment, They become the version of them you fell for. But the good days don't erase the bad ones. They don't undo the confusion, the silence, the ache of being unseen even when you're right beside them. Staying for the good days is like building a life on borrowed sunlight. Warm for a while, but never lasting. And the cost? It's your peace, your sense of self, your capacity to trust that love shouldn't hurt more than it heals. You were not made to live on scraps of kindness. You were not meant to keep proving your worth to someone who only sees it when it's convenient. So tonight, let go of the fantasy that a few good days are reason enough to stay through countless painful ones. You deserve consistency, not emotional roulette. Let your heart rest now. Even the sun sets, and that's not the end of light. It's just the beginning of a different kind of glow. Now let's move on to the next chapter. Mistaking pain for passion. It started like fire. Intense, unpredictable, consuming. You mistook the heat for love, the jealousy for care, the arguments for passion, the emotional whiplash for something deep and real. They'd hurt you, then pull you close. They'd break you, then whisper that you're everything. And in the chaos, you felt needed, seen even if it was through storm-clouded eyes. You told yourself this is what love looks like. Messy, raw, powerful. You believed that the highs and lows were signs of depth, not dysfunction. You began to crave the cycle, the fall, the fracture, the feverish makeup. And so pain became part of the package. The more it hurt, the more convinced you were that it meant something real. Because if it didn't mean something, why would it feel this intense? But passion does not have to be painful. Real love does not require you to bleed to prove you're alive. It does not swing between adoration and abandon. There is a difference between electricity and safety, between chemistry and chaos, between being wanted and being valued. You were taught, perhaps, that struggle meant sincerity. But tonight, let that belief soften. Let it unravel gently from around your heart. You do not have to suffer to feel connected. You do not need to be burned to feel warmth. There is a love that is steady, calm, and kind. Not boring, but safe. Not cold, but clear. Rest now, and dream of a passion that does not require pain to prove its depth. Now let's move on to the next chapter. Mistaking pain for passion. It started like fire. Intense, unpredictable, consuming. You mistook the heat for love, the jealousy for care, the arguments for passion, the emotional whiplash for something deep and real. They'd hurt you, then pull you close. They'd break you, then whisper that you're everything. And in the chaos, you felt needed, seen even if it was through storm-clouded eyes. You told yourself this is what love looks like. Messy, raw, powerful. You believed that the highs and lows were signs of depth, not dysfunction. You began to crave the cycle, the fall, the fracture, the feverish makeup. And so pain became part of the package. The more it hurt, the more convinced you were that it meant something real. Because if it didn't mean something, why would it feel this intense? But passion does not have to be painful. Real love does not require you to bleed to prove you're alive. It does not swing between adoration and abandon. There is a difference between electricity and safety, between chemistry and chaos, between being wanted and being valued. You were taught, perhaps, that struggle meant sincerity. But tonight, let that belief soften. Let it unravel gently from around your heart. You do not have to suffer to feel connected. You do not need to be burned to feel warmth. There is a love that is steady, calm, and kind. Not boring, but safe. not cold, but clear. Rest now and dream of a passion that does not require pain to prove its depth. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Love that feels like withdrawal. It's a strange thing, isn't it? How love, what's meant to be warm, soft, safe, can start to mimic addiction. You don't miss them exactly. You miss the feeling of being wanted, even if only sometimes. You miss the highs, the moments when they made you feel like you were everything. And when they pull away, as they always do, your heart starts aching like a body in detox. This isn't love. This is withdrawal. Your mind replays the good times like old songs you can't stop humming. You scroll through messages, reread apologies, search for signs that it wasn't all manipulation, that maybe there was some truth in the tenderness, that maybe they did love you, just not in the way you needed to be loved. But what you're feeling now is not longing. It's the emptiness left behind when the rush fades, the silence that fills the room when the drama dies down, the eerie quiet after a storm you've lived in for far too long. Withdrawal feels like heartbreak because your body learned to expect their chaos as normal. And without it, you feel unanchored, adrift, numb. But what if that numbness is your nervous system resetting? What if the stillness isn't loneliness, but healing? Tonight, let yourself breathe through the ache. Don't rush to replace it. Don't reach back for the noise. Let the quiet hold you. Let your heart detox from a love that hurt more than it helped. Because love shouldn't feel like losing yourself every time they leave. Let sleep wash over you. Gently, patiently, like a love that never asks you to earn your peace. Now let's move on to the next chapter. But they were good once. You hold on to that one moment, the way they looked at you when everything still felt new, the softness in their voice, the tenderness in their touch, the way they made you feel like you were finally enough. You replay those moments like a lullaby, the time they stayed up with you all night, the way they held your hand in the car, the way their eyes sparkled when they talked about the future you thought you were building together. And when things got bad, when they grew distant, when the apologies felt empty, when the blame landed more on you than ever on them, you returned to that early version of them. The one who once showed up, the one who once made you believe. But they were good once, you whisper to yourself. And maybe they were. Or maybe they were just on their best behavior until they knew you'd stay. It's easy to forgive when you're haunted by memories of who they used to be. It's harder to admit that the version you loved hasn't been around for a long time. And even harder still to realize that maybe that version was never real. Maybe it was a mask or a fleeting glimpse of who they wanted to be. But love is not a museum of past moments. It's not something you preserve in hopes it comes alive again. Love is lived in the now. And if today it hurts more than it heals, then yesterday's sweetness cannot save you. Tonight, let yourself release the ghost of who they were. You are not betraying the good by walking away from the bad. You are honoring the truth of what love is meant to feel like. Not just once, but always. Let your memories rest now, and let yourself fall asleep without needing to believe that the past could return to rescue you. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The need to fix what hurt you. There's a part of you that believes if you just try hard enough, love well enough, stay long enough, you can heal them. You see their pain, their wounds barely hidden beneath the surface, and something in you aches to rescue them. You imagine your patience will be the turning point, that your softness will rewrite their story, that if you can just endure a little longer, They'll finally become the person you always believed they could be. But the truth is, this isn't healing. This is surviving. This is self-sacrifice dressed as devotion. This is bleeding quietly while tending to someone else's wounds. You were never meant to be someone's emotional first aid kit, their personal therapist, their savior. You were meant to love, not fix. You were meant to grow, not shrink, so they can feel whole. Yet somewhere deep inside, you confuse their suffering with your purpose. You think if you leave, they'll fall apart. You think if you stop giving, you're abandoning them. But what about you? What about the nights you spent nurturing someone who never once asked how your heart was doing? You cannot fix what broke you. You cannot stay inside a burning house just to prove you're not afraid of fire. Tonight, let go of the burden to save someone who keeps hurting you. It's not your job to complete them. It's not your duty to teach them what love should look like. Your healing doesn't require their transformation. It begins the moment you stop tying your worth to their change. So rest now. Let yourself exhale. You were never meant to carry their healing at the cost of your own. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Becoming addicted to apologies. It begins subtly. A soft, "I'm sorry," after they cross a line, spoken just sweetly enough to make you second-guess the pain. You forgive. Because their remorse feels real. Because you want to believe that the person who hurt you is still capable of loving you. But slowly, you start to crave the apology more than the change. It becomes its own kind of high. That brief moment when they admit fault, when the chaos settles, when it feels like things might finally get better. And then, it starts again. They hurt. They apologize. You forgive. And somewhere in that cycle, the apology becomes your reward. The proof that they still care. The thread that keeps you hanging on. But what you don't notice at first is that the words begin to hollow out. The remorse fades faster. The promises blur. You find yourself explaining your pain more than feeling understood. You start bracing for the fall, waiting for the next sorry to stitch you back together. This isn't love. This is dependency on repair instead of respect. This is hoping for peace in a war they keep restarting. This is mistaking apology for accountability. You deserve more than words that come too late, spoken only when silence no longer works. Tonight, let yourself imagine a love that doesn't need to be mended each night, where safety is constant, not temporary, where the one who holds your heart knows how to not break it in the first place. Let your nervous system rest. Let your mind float beyond the loops it was trained to spin in. You are not here to be the forgiver of all things. You are here to be cherished, not just repaired. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Patterns that repeat your childhood. It's strange, isn't it? How something can feel familiar without ever feeling safe. You tell yourself you're with someone different, a new name, a new face. But the way they make you feel, unseen, unheard, unworthy, it echoes something ancient. You don't realize it at first, how the fights feel like déjà vu, how their silence reminds you of the cold you knew too early, how their praise feels conditional, earned only when you disappear a little. And then it hits you. You've been here before, not with them, but long ago. When love came with rules, when affection had a clock, when your needs were too big for someone else's world. So now, you unconsciously reach for what's familiar. Not because it's good, but because it's known. You replay the old script, trying to rewrite the ending. Maybe if you love them enough, they'll stay. Maybe if you behave just right, they'll change. Maybe this time, you won't be abandoned. But this time is not the past. You are no longer that child searching for safety in unsafe places. You are allowed to stop repeating pain just because it feels like home. Tonight, let yourself break the pattern. You are not bound to the echoes of your upbringing. You are not cursed to chase people who can't see you. You can choose peace. You can choose gentleness. You can choose to write a new story, one where your worth isn't questioned, your love isn't earned, and your soul is allowed to rest. You are not here to prove you are lovable. You are here to be loved, fully, freely, without performance. Let that truth cradle you as you drift into sleep. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Choosing familiar pain over unfamiliar peace. Sometimes, the silence feels louder than the storm ever did. Peace can be unnerving when all you've known is noise. You long for love, but when it finally comes quietly, without drama, without confusion, you flinch, because deep down, pain has become your compass. It points to what feels real. It anchors you to what feels like love. And so, when someone offers you calm, when their kindness doesn't spike your pulse, when they don't make you chase them, you question it. You question them. You question yourself. You tell yourself it's boring, that maybe you're just not that into them. But really, it's just that peace doesn't set off the alarms you've grown used to ignoring. You're not broken for craving chaos. You've simply adapted to survive it. And now, unfamiliar peace feels like a trick, a setup, a lull before the next disaster. But love isn't supposed to feel like walking on shards. It's not a reward for endurance. It's not a prize you win by shrinking. It's a resting place. A soft rhythm, a quiet hand that doesn't need to be clenched in fear. Tonight, let yourself unlearn the equation that said hurt equals love. Let yourself wonder what it would feel like to be at ease. To not have to decode texts, to not rehearse your reactions, to not mistake anxiety for affection. You don't have to earn tenderness by first surviving pain. You don't have to keep choosing the heartbreak you recognize over the peace that still feels distant. Let unfamiliar peace become your new pattern. One breath at a time, one gentle night at a time. Let go, not into chaos, but into calm. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. If you loved me, you would. There are words that don't scream, but still wound. They slide in quietly, disguised as logic, as reason, as love. If you loved me, you would. Do this. Change that. Stop being who you are and start becoming what I need. It doesn't sound cruel at first. It sounds like compromise. It sounds like care. But listen closely. It's not a request. It's a condition. A quiet bargain. Your love for your self-abandonment. Soon, you begin to question what love even means. Is it measured by how much you give up? By how many pieces of yourself you're willing to trade to keep them happy? You start folding inwards, shrinking your voice, your needs, your joy, until you fit the mold they've cast in the shape of their comfort. And the worst part? They call it love. They say, if you cared, you'd understand. If you really loved me, you wouldn't make this so hard. But love is not a test you must pass by disappearing. True love doesn't demand that you lose yourself. It invites you to bring your whole self in. Flaws, dreams, boundaries, and all. Tonight, let yourself breathe back into your body. Let the silence remind you of who you were before love became a series of impossible tasks. You don't have to prove your heart by breaking it. You don't have to meet conditions to be worthy. Love that asks you to vanish is not love. It is control in a mask of longing. Let go. Not of love. but of the performance you were never meant to play. Now let's move on to the next chapter. Turning your vulnerability against you. At first, it felt safe to open up. Childhood sweethearts reunited. There's something timeless about the people who knew you before the world told you who to be. Before ambition, before heartbreak, before your voice changed or your laughter became cautious. Somewhere in the soft shadow of a sleepy village, two souls once ran barefoot through fields, chasing dragonflies, sharing secrets under banyan trees. They were children, wide-eyed, wild-hearted, without the language of love, but feeling it anyway. Time, like a gentle tide, pulled them apart. Different cities, different lives, different dreams that whispered them away from each other's orbit. But sometimes, life has a strange way of returning us to what once felt like home. And one golden afternoon, in the hush of an old railway station, their eyes met again. Older now, wiser, but still carrying the memory of those childhood summers pressed like dried flowers between the pages of their hearts. They spoke carefully at first, then laughed easily, then remembered, not with nostalgia, but with awe that something unspoken had survived the years. You too may know someone like that, someone whose name still hums like a lullaby. And maybe, just maybe, reunion is not about returning, but about remembering who we were when we were still whole. Now, let's move on to the next chapter, twisting the truth to win. Truth is supposed to be a shelter, a place where love can rest without fear of distortion. But in toxic love, truth becomes a game, a shifting shape, a weapon with no fingerprints. They don't lie outright, always. Sometimes they just adjust the details, omit a fact, reframe the memory. And by the time you realize, the truth has already been dressed in clothes it never wore. You remember what was said. You know what was done. But they insist. That's not how it happened. You're overreacting. You're making things up again. And suddenly, you're no longer sure if the ground you're standing on is real. This is how truth becomes a tool, not to build intimacy, but to assert control, not to resolve, but to confuse. They win the argument, not because they're right, but because they make you doubt what you know. And you start keeping notes in your mind, little timestamps of truth. You question your memory. You question your sanity. You even question why it matters so much to be understood. But here's the thing. It matters because the truth is sacred. It is not a chessboard. It is not a prize for the most persuasive. Love, real love, doesn't twist reality to win. It doesn't need you to forget your version of events just to keep the peace. Tonight, remember this. Your truth is valid, even if they denied it, even if they mocked it, even if they tried to edit it. You don't need permission to believe your own experience. You were there. You lived it. You remember. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Using secrets as leverage. We all carry secrets. Soft, hidden things we only offer to those we believe will protect them. You shared yours in a moment of trust. A confession wrapped in trembling honesty. A memory that still stung. A regret you whispered through tears, a truth you barely understood yourself. And they listened. They nodded. They pulled you closer. You thought, maybe this is what intimacy feels like, to be known so deeply and still held with care. But that care didn't last. Over time, you began to see your secrets reshaped into threats. Sometimes spoken aloud in anger, other times used silently as leverage. A raised eyebrow, a mocking laugh, a cruel reference in public that no one else understood but you. They knew exactly which truths made you small, and they kept them in a drawer marked, use when necessary. That's the thing about toxic love. It builds a library of your pain not to help you heal, but to win arguments, control behavior, maintain power. It doesn't say, "I love you even more because you trusted me." It says, "I love that I now have something to hold over you." But love, real love, is a sanctuary for your secrets, a place where your shadows can breathe without fear. Tonight, breathe this in. You didn't do wrong by opening up. The wrong was in how they used your honesty as currency. Let the shame fall away. Your past is not a pawn. Your vulnerability is still sacred. You are still worthy of love that holds, not harnesses. Now, let's move on to the next chapter, conditional affection. There's a kind of love that feels like a transaction. You don't notice it at first, because in the beginning, everything feels generous. The words are sweet. The touch is warm. The affection flows freely until it doesn't. Until one day you find yourself earning it. Suddenly, your silence buys their smile. Your compliance earns a kiss. Your self-abandonment gets you one more day without tension. You start to learn the rules, unspoken, shifting, exhausting. Love becomes a system of approvals and rejections, of rewards and punishment. You dress a certain way, and they're kind. You speak up, and the warmth disappears. They don't yell. They don't strike. They just withdraw. The absence of affection becomes the consequence. And so you adapt. You smile when you're hurting. You agree when you're aching. You twist yourself into smaller and smaller versions of who you once were, just to keep love in the room. Because every time you think, "Maybe I'll leave," they give you a glimpse, a taste, a spark of that same love you remember from the beginning. But this isn't love. This is emotional economics, a system where love is currency and you're always in debt. True love isn't earned through silence. It isn't conditional upon your obedience. It doesn't vanish because you made a mistake or asked for more. Tonight, let yourself rest from the constant negotiation. Let your heart remember what it feels like to receive love that's not a reward, but a given. You are not too much. You are not hard to love. You're simply someone who deserves love that stays. Even when you speak, even when you cry, even when you say no. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Making you doubt what you felt. At first, your emotions felt like a compass. Your heart whispered truths. Your gut pointed the way. You knew when something felt off, when a word cut too deep, when silence was sharp instead of soft. But in toxic love, your feelings slowly become negotiable. You say, "That hurt me." And they reply, "You're too sensitive." You say, "I feel anxious when you disappear." And they smirk, "You're just being dramatic." Each time they don't comfort you. They correct you. They chip away at your emotional confidence until you're left staring into a mirror asking, "Did I imagine it? Was I overreacting? Am I the problem?" You start to replay every moment, every tone, every pause, every word you said, not to understand what happened, but to prove to yourself that what you felt was real. You become a detective in your own story, trying to validate emotions that once came so clearly. That's the cruelty of this pattern. It doesn't erase the pain. It erases your right to feel it. And when you lose trust in your feelings, you lose the ability to protect yourself, to walk away, to say, "This is not okay." But tonight, let this be your gentle reminder. Your feelings are not flaws. They are signals. They are guides. And they are yours. No one else lives inside your skin. No one else gets to rewrite your experience. So trust what tightened in your chest, what made your shoulders curl, what brought tears to your eyes when no one was looking. That was your truth. Soft, sacred, and real. And it still is. Now let's move on to the next chapter, blaming you for their anger. It starts with a moment. A slammed door, a sharp word, a silence that suddenly stings. You feel it in your stomach first. That quiet panic, that shame-shaped whisper asking, "What did I do wrong?" Because somehow, it's always your fault. They raise their voice, but it's because you pushed them. They storm out, but only because you wouldn't listen. They shut down for days, but you were too much again. In their eyes, your emotions provoke. Your needs demand. Your very presence is an ignition switch they claim you control. But this isn't accountability. This is projection. This is punishment disguised as logic. They don't own their rage. They outsource it. And you, soft, loyal, aching to make things better, accept it. You start tiptoeing around moods, predicting tempests, apologizing for thunder you never created. You rewrite memories. Not to remember what happened, but to justify why they exploded. Maybe you shouldn't have said that, so maybe your tone was wrong. Maybe. But listen now. Their anger is theirs. Their explosions are not your burden to absorb. Everyone feels rage. But healthy love says, "I'm hurting, and I want to understand." Not, "You made me this way." Tonight, rest from the weight of carrying emotions that aren't yours. You are not responsible for someone else's storm. You do not deserve to live inside their weather. Your presence is not the cause, and your peace doesn't require their permission. Let that truth wash over you now. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The disguised ultimatum. Not all ultimatums sound like threats. Sometimes they wear smiles. They arrive dressed in love, spoken softly, but carved with quiet control. If you really loved me, you wouldn't need anyone else. I guess we're just not right for each other if you don't change. It's your choice, but you know what I need. These are not open conversations. They are quiet corners, emotional cages built with velvet bars. You think you're making decisions, but each one is rigged with consequence. Each no is laced with distance. Each boundary is met with withdrawal. Suddenly, your love becomes a test you're always about to fail. Do you choose yourself, or do you choose them? But the question is false, because real love doesn't force a choice between wholeness and belonging. It makes room. It listens. It doesn't punish you for staying connected to your truth. These disguised ultimatums are not about your flaws. They're about control. They aim to make your freedom feel like betrayal, to make your independence seem like rejection. So you shrink. You comply. You say yes when your body says no. Not because you're weak, but because you were told that saying no meant losing everything. But love built on fear is not love at all. It's manipulation in disguise. Tonight, let your nervous system rest. Let your heart uncoil from the guilt. You don't have to earn love by surrendering yourself. You're allowed to choose without fear. You're allowed to stay whole and still be loved. And anyone who makes you believe otherwise isn't offering love. They're demanding obedience. And you were made for more than that. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. When kindness comes with a price. In the beginning, it feels like warmth, like someone finally sees you. They do something thoughtful. Bring you food, listen to your fears, offer help when you didn't even ask. And you think, this is love. This is safety. This is what it means to be chosen. But soon, you learn there's a ledger, a running tally, invisible but always present. Every kindness becomes a currency. Every gesture, a transaction. They do something for you, then expect obedience in return. They remind you, after everything I've done. Or they don't say it at all. They just grow colder when you set a boundary, withdraw affection when you don't agree, hold back warmth unless you comply. You start wondering if you're allowed to say no anymore, if your gratitude has become your prison. Because when kindness comes with a price, it's not kindness, it's leverage. And love should never feel like debt. You were not made to perform thankfulness just to stay close. Your worth isn't measured by how much you accept without question. And care that comes with strings attached is control wrapped in ribbons. You deserve love that's offered freely, with no scoreboard, no silent punishments, no invisible contracts. Let your body exhale now. You don't have to earn your place. You don't have to trade your truth for tokens of affection. Real kindness heals. It doesn't bind. Real love gives, not to own, but to connect. And you, just as you are, deserve that kind of love. Now let's move on to the next chapter. Flattery that feels like a trap. It begins with praise so rich, so sweet. It feels like sunlight after a lifetime of gray. I've never met anyone like you. You're everything I've ever wanted. No one understands me like you do. At first, you glow in it. You breathe it in like oxygen, a balm for old wounds. You feel seen, adored, worshipped. But slowly, it starts to feel off. Because the pedestal is high, too high, and every move you make feels like a test to stay there. You start worrying. What if you disappoint them? What if you stop being perfect? Their flattery, once comforting, starts to confine you. You become afraid to show anger, to disagree, to need space. Because love that's built on fantasy shatters the moment you act human. And when you falter, even gently, the tone shifts. The compliments vanish. They say you've changed, that you're not who they thought you were. Suddenly the love feels conditional. The pedestal becomes a cage. You were praised, not to be cherished, but to be controlled. Adored, not for who you are, but for how well you reflected their ideal. That's not love. That's possession. So let your breath return to its rhythm. You are not here to be someone's fantasy. You are not here to be perfect. You are here to be real. Messy, evolving, whole. You deserve affection that celebrates your depth, not just your shine. Admiration that welcomes your shadows, not just your light. Because the love that lasts isn't built on pedestals. It's built on truth. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Love that's always distracted. You sit beside them, but feel galaxies away. Their eyes are on you, but not in you. Their hands may touch, but their presence drifts. Like smoke, you can never quite hold. It's not that they don't say, "I love you." It's that the words float without weight, as if spoken out of habit, not anchored in attention. You share a story, and their phone buzzes. You bear a worry, and they change the subject. You cry, and they ask if you're done yet. This is love, but only halfway. Only when it's easy. Only when it fits within their convenience. You start to shrink your needs, to keep them close. You begin editing your feelings, so they'll stay engaged. You learn to smile faster, to talk less, to need nothing. Because when love is always distracted, your pain becomes background noise. And you wonder, is it better to be ignored than to be alone? But being half-loved is a slow erosion. Not a cut, but a wearing down. A silent dissolving of your worth. You deserve love that looks up when you speak. That puts down the phone, leans in, asks more. Not out of duty, but desire. You deserve to be the moment, not the afterthought. Tonight, rest from the exhaustion of invisibility. Let your breath remind you that your presence matters. You are not too much for someone truly paying attention. And one day, you'll know what it feels like to be fully seen without having to beg for it. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Being lonely beside someone. Loneliness isn't always loud. Sometimes, it whispers in the quiet space between two people who used to speak without words. It settles in the silence when your laughter dies on their indifference. It echoes through the room, even while their body lies right next to you. There is a special ache, a sharp kind of grief, in feeling alone when you're not actually alone. You lie side by side, but they don't ask how your day was. You sit across the table, but they don't notice the sigh in your chest. Your voice reaches them, but never seems to land. Your eyes search, but there's no one looking back. You used to talk for hours. Now, it's minutes. Used to dream together. Now, you dream alone. You start blaming yourself. Maybe you're asking for too much. Maybe this is just what long-term love looks like. Maybe everyone feels like this. But deep down, you know that's not true. Real love doesn't vanish with routine. It doesn't grow numb with time. It may shift, evolve, soften. But it should never make you feel like a stranger in your own heart. Loneliness in love is a wound that hides. You dress it with distractions. You scroll, you clean, you smile in public. But in the stillness, you feel it. The ache of wanting more while pretending it's enough. Let yourself grieve tonight. Not just the distance, but the hope that things might go back. You don't have to settle for proximity over intimacy. You don't have to make peace with being unseen. You deserve presence. You deserve tenderness that doesn't need reminders. You deserve to be known, even in silence. You deserve not just love, but closeness. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. When they hear you but never listen, you speak. They nod. Maybe they even repeat your words back to you. But somewhere between your voice and their response, your truth disappears. It's a strange, hollow feeling. To be heard but not felt. To explain your pain and watch their eyes glaze over, like they're already waiting for their turn to reply. You tell them you're tired. They say, everyone's tired. You express what hurt you. They say, you're too sensitive. You ask for a change. They say, why are you never satisfied? And so, you start second-guessing yourself. You start speaking less, so you'll be less difficult. You start editing your words, choosing silence over confrontation. Because what's the point of telling the truth if it's going to be twisted, dismissed, or forgotten? But let's be clear. This is not miscommunication. This is neglect dressed as conversation. This is connection with the volume turned down. This is emotional dismissal masquerading as politeness. You're not asking for too much when you want your words to matter. You're not needy because you long to feel understood. You're human. To be deeply listened to is a form of love. It's not just hearing your words, but holding the emotions beneath them. Not just waiting for you to finish, but leaning in, truly wanting to know. So tonight, let go of the version of love that makes you feel like a burden for speaking. Let your voice be yours again. Let your truth echo where it will be met with softness, not resistance. You deserve a love that doesn't just hear, but listens with its whole heart. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Celebrating your pain instead of easing it. Pain should be met with comfort, not applause. But sometimes, the person you turn to becomes the one who turns your suffering into a spotlight. A moment for their pride, their control, their ego. You cry, and they smirk, as if your heartbreak proves their power. You break, and they boast, as if your pain is a prize they secretly wanted to win. Maybe they say things like, "You're too emotional. See? You always make things dramatic." Or worse, they grow calm when you're unraveling, smiling while you tremble, shrugging as you bleed. There is something deeply jarring about being vulnerable in front of someone who enjoys your vulnerability. Not because they care, but because it makes them feel superior, untouchable, in control. And it gets worse. They retell your wounds to others, twisting your pain into punchlines. You become a story, not a person, a lesson to mock, not a soul to hold. You begin to hide your tears. You learn to suffer in silence, not because you're healing, but because you know your hurt will only be used against you. That's not love. That's cruelty in disguise. Because real love doesn't celebrate your pain. It rushes to ease it. It listens when you tremble. It wraps itself around your ache and says, "I'm here. I won't let this be too heavy for you alone." Tonight, let yourself feel what you buried. Not for them, but for you. You don't have to protect the person who never protected you. You don't have to smile through what shattered you. You deserve a love that cradles your pain, not claps at your collapse. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Being ignored when you're in crisis. There comes a moment when the world spins too fast, when your heart feels too heavy, when everything inside you whispers, "Please, someone see me." And so you reach out. You call, you text, you speak through trembling breath. You try to explain. You're not okay. But what do? They reply hours later with a joke. They change the subject. They act like it's no big deal. Or worse, they say nothing at all. Silence. When you needed presence. Indifference. When you begged for warmth. There's a unique kind of abandonment in being invisible during your most visible pain. Maybe you were grieving. Maybe you were panicking. Maybe your mind was spiraling, and you just needed someone to say, "I'm here. Talk to me. I won't let you go through this alone." But they weren't there, and their absence was louder than your scream. You start telling yourself not to bother people, that you're too much, that you should be able to handle this alone. You put on a brave face, but inside, you're carrying a weight no one helped you hold. And the question rises, again and again. If they're not there when I'm drowning, what is their love for? Love is not proven in sunshine. It's revealed in the storm. And when someone disappears the moment you need shelter, you learn that their love was only ever weather dependent. Tonight, let your heart cry for the care you never received. And then, let it soften into a new truth. Your pain deserves to be met, not ignored, not minimized, not left unseen. You deserve a love that stays, especially when everything else falls apart. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. When you're the only one, trying you give, and give, and give again. You text first. You plan the visits. You bring up the hard conversations. You remember their needs, anticipate their moods. Bend so far backwards you forget what standing tall ever felt like. And in return? Silence. A shrug. A half-hearted effort. Or maybe nothing at all. There's a quiet kind of heartbreak in doing all the emotional labor while someone else simply exists beside you, watching, receiving, rarely reaching back. You begin to wonder, is this love or just endurance? Maybe they say you're too sensitive, that you care too much, as if your effort is a flaw instead of a gift. Maybe they call your devotion dramatic, your concern controlling, your love a burden too heavy to carry. But real love is not one-sided work. It's not an endless loop of proving your worth to someone who barely tries. It's not running marathons while they nap on the sidelines and call it companionship. Trying alone doesn't mean the relationship is working. It means you are. And slowly, you start to fade. Your voice gets softer. Your light grows dim. Because even the brightest flame can die in the absence of oxygen. Tonight, acknowledge the exhaustion. Feel how deeply you've been carrying what should have been shared. You're not too much. You've just been with someone who gave too little. You deserve a love that tries as much as you do. That meets you in the middle. That doesn't watch you burn and call it warmth. You are allowed to stop trying for someone who never really started. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Affection that's always delayed. It always comes too late. The tenderness, the apology, the warmth you hoped would arrive when you needed it most. Always kept just out of reach, like a sunset that disappears before you can feel its heat. They don't hug you when you're breaking. They don't call when your voice trembles. They wait until the storm has passed, until you've cleaned your own wounds, until you've convinced yourself to move on, and only then do they show affection, soft words, empty gestures. And you wonder, why now? Why not then? This delayed love feels more like control than care, because it teaches you to stay just a little longer, chasing the scraps of what you always hoped they'd give in the moment you needed it most. You begin to live on the hope that maybe next time, they'll show up on time. Maybe next time, their love won't be late. But next time never arrives the way you imagined. Because affection, real affection, isn't withheld like a reward. It's given freely, without delay, especially when your heart is raw and reaching. They say the right things after you've already cried. They hold you when you've already gone numb. They arrive once the damage is done. That's not love. That's a cycle. Tonight, let yourself feel how painful it's been to live off love that only shows up after the moment has passed. You are not asking for too much. You are asking for timing, presence, and truth. You deserve affection that meets you where you are, not where it's most convenient. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Love that only shows up in public. They hold your hand when eyes are watching. They smile wide when friends are near. They speak of us at parties, post pictures, tag moments, tell the world they adore you. Yet behind closed doors, you're not sure who they really are. In private, they're distant, distracted, uninterested. They scroll through their phone while you sit beside them, craving a glance, a word, a touch that isn't rehearsed for others. You begin to notice the pattern, how their warmth has an audience, how their affection is performative, how you feel lonelier in their arms at night than you do walking alone in daylight. It confuses you, because the world sees something beautiful, a couple that looks like they have it all, and you carry the weight of pretending that maybe it's true. Maybe it's enough that they show up in public, even if they disappear in private. But love isn't real if it's only visible when others are watching. Love is in the small, silent moments. When you're sick, when you're anxious, when you need to talk about the hard things no one else knows you're carrying. You deserve a love that lives in the quiet, not just the spotlight. One that shows up not because of the world's gaze, but because of you. Your needs, your soul, your sacred, ordinary life. Tonight, release the illusion that public affection means private intimacy. Remember, you are not here to be a prop in someone else's love story. You are here to be held, even when no one is looking. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Being an afterthought in their world. You weren't in their plans. Not really. You were added in later, an adjustment, an accessory to their already prioritized life. You notice it in the way they forget to tell you important things. The job offer, the trip, the gathering you only heard about through someone else. You weren't consulted. You were informed, like a footnote in the story of their day. And still, you try to justify it. They're just busy. They didn't mean to exclude me. But deep down, you feel it. That cold, quiet sting of realizing you are not a priority. You are not front of mind. You are not a constant in their inner world. You're the one who rearranges, the one who adjusts your schedule, changes your plans, makes space. But they never seem to make space for you. You find yourself standing on the outside of their life, peering through the glass, watching them move through choices and changes that you were never really part of. And it hurts. Because love, real love, invites you in. It doesn't forget you. It doesn't treat you like a backup plan, a convenience, a name on a long list of maybes. Tonight, take a breath and feel what you've been pushing down. The ache of being someone's afterthought when all you ever wanted was to be someone's home. You deserve to be considered, included, cherished, not tolerated. You're not too needy. You're just tired of living in the margins of someone else's story. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. When you're left out of their future, they speak of dreams that don't include your name, of places they want to go, things they want to build, a life they imagine. But you are not in the picture. You listen carefully, hoping to hear the word we instead of I, hoping for even the smallest thread that ties your paths together. But the future they paint feels like a world you're not invited into, and you start to wonder if you were ever part of the plan. You drop hints, ask questions like, "Where do you see us in a year?" And they answer in vague echoes, non-committal, evasive, as if the idea of permanence makes them flinch. And yet, you stay. Because the present has its tender moments. Because the fear of losing them sometimes feels heavier than the fear of being left behind. But here's the quiet truth. A love that doesn't include you in the future is already abandoning you in the present. It's not just about dates or plans. It's about the emotional investment to build something together, not just orbit in parallel. You deserve a love that speaks your name when it imagines tomorrow. That says, when we move, when we grow, when we get through this together. Tonight, give yourself permission to mourn the absence of a future that was never real, to grieve what you thought might one day be, and then slowly begin to dream again. But this time, a future that includes you fully, as more than a passenger, as the author of your own unfolding. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Staying for who they could be. It wasn't who they were that made you stay. It was who they might become. The glimmers of tenderness, the flashes of kindness, the moments that felt like magic before they disappeared again. You held on to the version they almost were. The one they showed you in between the cold silences, the sharp words, the broken promises. You believed in their potential, in the soft eyes they sometimes had, in the apologies that felt sincere, in the way they said, "I'm trying," even when the trying was invisible. And so you stayed, through nights of doubt, through days of walking on eggshells, through 1,000 tiny heartbreaks you never told anyone about. You told yourself they just needed time, that love was about patience, that maybe if you held on long enough, they'd finally become the person you saw in those rare, radiant moments. But love isn't about waiting for someone to change. It's not about shrinking so they have more room to grow. It's not about sacrificing your peace for the sake of their someday. The truth is, You deserve to be loved by someone who already knows how, who doesn't need to hurt you before they learn how to hold you. Tonight, let yourself feel the ache of loving someone's potential more than their reality. Let yourself grieve the dream you built around a person who never quite stepped into it. And then, release it. You are not here to raise someone into love. You are here to be met where you are, wholeheartedly, willingly now. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Falling in love with potential. It started with a spark, not of who they were, but who they could be. You saw something in them, a light buried under the chaos, a softness beneath the sharp edges. And maybe, just maybe, you believed you were the one meant to bring it out, to nurture it, coax it forward, stay patient while it bloomed. But what you were really loving wasn't a person. It was a possibility, an imagined version they never quite became. You built a story around that version, filled in the gaps with hope and imagination, told yourself they're just wounded, they just need time, they're almost there. You clung to the idea that one day you'd both look back and be glad you stayed. But time passed, and the person in front of you remained the same, or worse. Apologies turned into patterns. Excuses became expectations, and your needs were always the ones delayed. You started to feel guilty for wanting more, for asking for basic kindness, for dreaming of love that felt safe instead of strained. Here's the gentle truth. You cannot build a life on what-ifs. You cannot feel loved by a future that never arrives. Falling in love with potential is a lonely kind of love, because it asks you to stay not for who they are, but for who you hope they'll become, even if that person only exists in your imagination. Tonight, remind yourself, you deserve a love that is real, not just rehearsed in your mind. A love that shows up fully, today. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The myth of one day they'll change. There's a whisper we cling to when the love we have starts to hurt more than it heals. One day, they'll change. It's not loud, not obvious, but it echoes in the spaces between disappointments. It settles in after every fight, after every apology that barely scratches the surface. You repeat it like a lullaby, a promise to your aching heart that this pain is temporary, that love is still coming. You imagine them waking up one morning, finally seeing what you see, the damage, the patterns, the way you bend just to keep peace. You hold on through the coldness, the silence, the words that bruise, because your heart has invested in a version of them that doesn't yet exist. But here's the quiet wound of that belief. Waiting for change becomes your cage. It postpones your healing, extends your grief, and makes your worth conditional on someone else's awakening. Yes, people can change, but real change is chosen, not begged for, not bargained into being. And when someone knows they're hurting you but does it anyway, again and again, that's not transformation on the horizon. That's a pattern. You were never meant to spend your love like currency for their evolution. You were never meant to shrink your voice so they'd finally grow theirs. Tonight, let yourself grieve the version of them you believed would arrive. Let yourself step away from the waiting room of their potential. Because the love that frees you won't ask you to wait until it becomes kind. It will already be. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Holding on to the good memories. There were good days. You remember them so vividly that they feel more real than the pain. The way their smile softened your fear. The warmth of their hand in yours. The laughter that once filled your lungs like wind in a quiet sail. You replay those moments as if they can rewrite the rest, as if remembering them hard enough will somehow bring them back. Because when love starts to rot, the sweet parts become sacred. You polish them like glass until they shine brighter than the cracks. But memory is a gentle liar. It dims the sharpness of pain, blurs the edges of wounds, and when you feel lost, it leads you back to the past. Not as it was, but as you needed it to be. You tell yourself, maybe it wasn't all that bad, because admitting how deeply it hurt feels like betraying the moments that once felt holy. But here's the truth your heart already knows. Good memories don't make bad patterns disappear. A single act of kindness cannot undo a season of cruelty, and nostalgia, no matter how warm, cannot build a future. You deserve love that's consistent, not nostalgic. Love that doesn't ask you to settle for fragments of happiness while bleeding through the rest. Tonight, you're allowed to hold those memories, to weep for them, to thank them for the comfort they gave. But don't let them convince you to stay where you keep breaking. Because the right love won't only live in your past, it will be present, here, now, and every day that follows. Now, let's move on to the next chapter, hoping this time will be different. Hope is a beautiful thing, soft like morning light. It creeps in when you least expect it. After the silence, after the fight, after yet another apology whispered without weight. You look into their eyes, and just for a moment, you see the version you've always wanted. The one who listens, the one who holds you, the one who seems to care. And something in you breathes. This time, maybe it's real. You start to rebuild, piece by fragile piece. You ignore the sinking feeling, push past the ache in your chest that remembers how this story always ends. You forgive before you've healed. You smile while bracing for the fall. You dress your wounds in hope because you don't know how to walk away without believing it could still get better. But how many times can you circle the same hurt and still call it love? How many times can you abandon your own voice to keep someone else's promises alive? Because every time you say, this time will be different, you're really saying, I'll shrink a little more. I'll try a little harder. I'll hurt a little longer. But love, true love, doesn't need to be reborn after every storm. It doesn't ask you to forget how many times it's broken you. Hope is powerful, but it should not be a leash that tethers you to pain. Tonight, rest in this truth. You do not have to keep hoping for someone else to change in order to be free. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is to stop waiting and start choosing yourself. Now, let's move on to the next chapter, believing in the version they pretended to be. They were never perfect, but in the beginning, they seemed so close, so kind, so warm, so effortlessly in tune with your needs that it felt like fate had finally whispered, here, this one is safe. They showed you the version you didn't even know you'd been searching for. They mirrored your softness, echoed your dreams, and gave you just enough love to make you believe this was something rare. But slowly, almost invisibly, the mask slipped. They weren't as gentle anymore. They stopped asking questions. Their attention frayed, their words cut deeper, their gaze became distant. And yet, you clung to that first version, the one who saw you, the one who made you laugh when you were tired of crying, the one who seemed to understand what made your soul ache and bloom. You started making excuses. It's just stress. They're going through something. They'll come back to who they were. But what if who they were was never who they truly are? What if the person you fell in love with was a mask crafted to pull you close, not a reflection of their soul, but of your desire to be deeply loved? The pain is not just in the loss, it's in the betrayal of the image you trusted. But even that image was a gift. It revealed what your heart longs for. It showed you how deeply you're capable of loving. And now, it teaches you that real love won't arrive in disguise. Tonight, grieve the version you thought was real. But don't stay chained to someone's illusion. You deserve a love that doesn't vanish when the mask falls. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Loving the illusion, not the reality. Sometimes, what we fall in love with isn't the person standing in front of us, but the story we've written about them. A story laced with hope, threaded with our longing, and stitched together by the quiet ache of wanting it to be true. You didn't fall in love with their cruelty, with their distance, with the way they dismissed your voice. You fell for the parts they only showed at first, for the tenderness that arrived like sunlight and left just as quickly. You loved the version you thought they could become. And so, you stayed, not for who they were, but for who you believed they might one day be. You edited their flaws in your mind. You softened the harshness, rewrote the endings, and painted over the cracks with color only your heart could see. But illusions are fragile. They shimmer in the distance and crumble up close. They ask you to squint, to stay far enough away so the truth doesn't become clear. And slowly, you began to wonder if the love you were holding on to was real at all. Not every connection is a soulmate. Some are just mirrors, reflecting back your need to feel safe, your yearning to be seen, your hunger to be chosen without conditions. Loving the illusion isn't your failure. It's a sign of your hope, your resilience, your refusal to stop believing in love. But now, you don't need fantasy to feel whole. You don't need to love someone only in your imagination. Tonight, let the illusion drift. Release the version that never truly existed, and open space for love that shows up as it is, honest, imperfect, and real. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Forgiving too soon, too often. There's a kind of forgiveness that blooms from strength, a quiet courage that says, I won't carry this pain any longer. But then there's the kind that grows from fear, from the trembling need to keep someone close, no matter how many times they've left you broken. You wanted to be the bigger person, to show grace, to keep peace, to believe that everyone deserves a second chance. So you forgave the first time, and then again, and again, until forgiveness became your way of surviving. You weren't just forgiving their mistakes. You were forgiving the way they kept making them. The lies that felt rehearsed. The apologies that sounded hollow. The promises that dissolved like breath on a mirror. And still, you hoped. Maybe this time will be the last time. Maybe they finally understand. Maybe I just need to love them harder. But what about the part of you that needed an apology and never got it? What about the wounds that kept reopening while you smiled through the pain? Forgiveness is beautiful, but not when it's used to silence your own voice. Not when it becomes the cage you lock yourself in, calling it love, calling it maturity, calling it patience. Tonight, ask yourself, have you been forgiving to free your heart, or to avoid being alone? You are allowed to stop giving passes to someone who keeps walking over your softness. You are allowed to say, I forgive you, but I cannot stay. Because peace isn't just something you give to others. It's something you deserve for yourself. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Fantasizing about their breakthrough. There's a story you keep telling yourself, One where they finally wake up. One where they finally see you, not as a burden, not as someone too sensitive, too much, too needy, but as someone worth fighting for. In that story, they change. They go to therapy. They listen. They unlearn their cruelty and confusion. They hold you in a way that feels safe for the first time in forever. And you think, maybe that version is still possible. Maybe all this waiting will mean something in the end. So you stay. You rewrite the pain as patience. You hold on to every kind gesture as proof that your dream is just around the corner. You hear the way they almost said what you needed, and it feels like progress. But what if the person you're hoping for only exists in your imagination? What if the breakthrough you're waiting on isn't theirs, but yours? The breakthrough where you realize you've been pouring your heart into someone who never asked to be saved. Someone who benefits from your belief in their better self, but has no intention of becoming it. It's not foolish to hope. It's human. And the part of you that held on to that dream was trying to protect you from heartbreak. But tonight, let your heart rest. You don't need to carry their potential on your shoulders anymore. You don't need to be the reason they transform. You deserve love that already meets you where you are. Not just in your fantasies, but in the quiet, consistent truth of someone who's ready now. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. When hope blinds you to hurt, hope is a gentle thing. A flicker in the darkness, a whisper that says, keep going. It'll get better. It's what makes us hold hands even when they let go first. It's what makes us say, they didn't mean it, even when the pain says otherwise. You didn't choose to suffer. You chose to hope. You clung to the idea that love would win, that they'd change, that the moments of sweetness meant more than the storms in between. But sometimes, hope becomes the veil that softens every red flag, every broken promise, every lonely night spent waiting for a version of them that never comes. You excused what hurt you because you hoped it wouldn't hurt forever. You called it patience, but it was survival. You called it loyalty, but it was fear dressed in faith. Hope made you rewrite the story again and again. Until their anger looked like passion, their silence felt like depth, and your emptiness was mistaken for endurance. But hope should never cost you your peace. It should not ask you to abandon yourself just to keep someone else's potential alive. Tonight, let's look gently at the hope that kept you there. It came from love, from the kind of heart that believes in people even when they stop believing in themselves. But now, your hope can be redirected, not into fixing someone else, but into rebuilding you. You deserve a future that doesn't need to be imagined, a love that doesn't require translation, a life where hope is no longer the bandage over your bruises, but the sunlight on your healing skin. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. What if I never find better? It's the question that echoes in the quiet, the one that crawls in after every almost good day, after every argument swept beneath the rug in the name of love. What if this is as good as it gets? What if no one else will understand you, tolerate you, stay for you? That question isn't born out of truth. It's born out of fear. Fear that your needs are too much, that your standards are too high, that you are somehow unworthy of gentle, lasting love. They may have whispered it into you between their silences and sighs, that you should be grateful, that no one else would be patient enough to stay. But here's the quiet secret. You were never too much. They were simply too little for the kind of love you carry. Staying out of fear isn't loyalty. It's slow erosion. It's shrinking your soul to fit inside someone else's limitations. The thought of starting over, can feel like staring at an ocean with no shore in sight. But healing does not ask you to leap. It only asks you to loosen your grip. Tonight, let the question unravel. Not, what if I never find better? But what if I already know what better feels like? And I've just been afraid to claim it. Better is not a perfect person. Better is peace. Better is consistency. Better is the version of you that doesn't have to beg to be treated like you matter. And you do matter. So when the question returns, what if I never find better? Answer gently, then I will become it. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Missing the pain. When it's gone. It sounds strange, doesn't it? To miss the very thing that broke you open. To ache for the chaos that once kept you awake crying into your pillow, wondering what you did wrong. But pain has a way of becoming familiar. It wraps around your nervous system like a song you didn't ask to memorize. And when it's gone, when the silence finally settles in, you're not sure whether to feel peace or emptiness. Sometimes we don't miss the person. We miss the intensity, the way they made our hearts race, even if it was out of fear. We miss the high of making them smile, because it meant we weren't failing. For now, you might find yourself replaying the fights like old scenes in a movie. Not because they were beautiful, but because they were alive. They made you feel something in a world that sometimes feels numb and too quiet. You learn to associate pain with presence. That if they were angry, at least they were there. That if it hurt, at least it meant something. But tonight, let yourself question that logic. What if love is not meant to be survived, but savored? What if peace is not emptiness, but finally, enough? Missing the pain doesn't mean you should return to it. It means you're learning to live without the noise. It means your body is remembering what stillness feels like and how to trust it. So if you miss the pain tonight, wrap your arms around yourself gently and whisper this truth. I deserve a life that doesn't hurt to keep. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Staying because you're afraid of silence. There's a silence that doesn't come with peace. It comes with a hush that feels like absence, a quiet that echoes louder than any scream. Sometimes, it's not the love that keeps us. It's the noise, the constant chatter of conflict, the roller coaster of affection and withdrawal, the ritual of decoding mixed signals until our minds become puzzle boxes we can no longer unlock. You stay, not because it feels right, but because the idea of being alone feels like falling into a bottomless well. You worry about the stillness that will come when their footsteps no longer echo through your life. You imagine the emptiness of a house without their mess, a phone that no longer lights up with apologies or half-hearted promises. But here's the truth hidden in silence. It's not empty. It's sacred. It's the first breath you take after holding it for far too long. It's the sound of your own voice finally returning to your chest. You've grown used to the background noise of being misunderstood, of asking for crumbs and calling it a feast, of living in a state of emotional suspense. But silence does not mean nothing is happening. It means everything is finally starting. The fear of quiet is often the fear of hearing your own truth. Because once it speaks, you can't unhear it. And once you hear it, you'll start choosing it. So if you're staying just to avoid the silence, remember, you were never meant to live in noise. You were meant to live in harmony. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Mourning the relationship. Before it ends. There is a kind of grief that blooms long before goodbye. It arrives quietly, in stolen glances that no longer hold warmth, in conversations that trail into silence, in the way your heart begins to ache even while they're still by your side. You start mourning not the person, but the version of them you once believed in. The one who held your hand without hesitation, who laughed with you like the world stood still. You begin grieving the dreams that were once shared, a future imagined, a life you both pretended to build even as the foundation cracked beneath your feet. It's the slow unraveling that hurts the most. Not the final blow, but the daily ache of fading affection, the way love becomes routine and touch becomes a transaction. You lie in bed next to someone who feels like a memory, and you wonder when the goodbye already happened. Was it in the way they stopped asking about your day? Was it in the moment you stopped correcting their lies because you were too tired to fight? And yet, you smile. You hold on. You keep showing up to a love that left long ago. Because the pain of leaving still feels sharper than the pain of staying. But here's the quiet truth. You've already started letting go. Every time you feel that lump in your throat, every time your tears fall without words, your heart is whispering, you deserve more than this. Mourning something before it ends doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're awake. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The fear of being alone with your thoughts. It's strange, isn't it? The way silence can feel deafening. Not the silence between two people, but the silence within yourself. When the voices outside finally quiet, and the only sound left is your own. For some, this stillness is a sanctuary. But for you, it feels like a storm. Because in that quiet, all the questions rise. All the memories come flooding in. All the truths you've tried to outrun begin whispering at the edges of your mind. And so, you stay. Not because it's love anymore, but because the noise of them drowns the noise of you. You fear being alone with your thoughts because they know the stories you've worked so hard to bury. They know the promises that were broken, the red flags you painted white, the boundaries you dissolved just to feel chosen. You fear the mirror of solitude because it reflects not only who you are, but who you became just to survive. But here's the gentle truth. Your thoughts aren't your enemies. They are the messengers of your healing. They are not there to torment you. They are there to free you. It's not easy sitting in a room with yourself, letting the silence ask its questions. But only in that silence can you finally begin to answer. What do you want? What have you lost? And who might you become if you dared to listen to the voice that's been waiting beneath the noise? You fear the silence because deep down, you know it will change you. And that change might just save you. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. When you're scared to start over. There's a moment after the ending when everything stands still. The world feels quieter, but not peaceful. More like a pause before a long, uncertain journey. You sit in that emptiness, the place between who you were with them and who you haven't become yet. And it's terrifying. Because starting over sounds brave when someone else says it. But when it's your heart, your memories, your pain, it feels like standing at the edge of the unknown with no map, no guide, and 1,000 what-ifs clinging to your back. What if I'm never loved like that again? What if I forget how to trust? What if being alone hurts more than pretending I was okay? You think of all the time you invested, the pieces of yourself you gave away, the versions of you that no longer exist. It feels like starting over means admitting it was all for nothing. But it wasn't. Because even pain teaches. Even heartbreak carves space for something truer. What if starting over isn't about erasing the past, but about carrying its lessons without its weight? What if beginning again isn't a punishment, but a gift? You're scared, and that's okay. Fear is just the signal that you're standing at the door of something real, something yours. And when you take that first step, even if you tremble, even if you cry, you're not starting from nothing. You're starting from experience, from growth, from truth. And that is a foundation stronger than any illusion you ever had to leave behind. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Grieving someone who's still here. It's one of the strangest heartbreaks, the kind no one talks about. To grieve someone who hasn't left the world, but has quietly exited your life. Their name is still saved in your phone. Their toothbrush might still sit beside yours. They pass you in the hallway. They sleep beside you in the bed. But somehow, they're already gone. You laugh less now, talk less, touch less. And in the silence between you, 1,000 unspoken goodbyes echo. How do you mourn a person whose body is present, but whose soul no longer meets yours? There are no funerals for this kind of loss, no condolences, no rituals to mark the slow fading of love that once felt eternal. So you grieve in quiet ways. You stare at the ceiling at 2 a.m., wondering what changed. You remember the way they used to look at you, like you were the center of their sky, and now they barely see you at all. And worse still, you question yourself. Am I imagining it? Am I the one pulling away? Is it them or me? You try to hold on, to resuscitate the past with memories, hope, and a desperate kind of love. But grief is honest, and your heart knows when it's holding on to a ghost. It's okay to mourn the version of them that loved you. It's okay to feel the ache even as they sit beside you. Because sometimes, letting go begins not with distance, but with the quiet acceptance that they're not coming back, not the way they were. And in that mourning, you begin to make room for someone who will truly stay. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Doubting your worth. Without them, there comes a moment when the silence after goodbye doesn't just echo. It accuses. You start to wonder, without their gaze, without their texts, without their chaos, who are you? They made you feel needed, even when they neglected you. They made you feel special, even when their love came with conditions. And now, stripped of their validation, your reflection looks unfamiliar. It's a quiet crisis, when your worth feels stitched to someone who's gone. You replay old conversations, moments when they made you feel small, times they walked away and you blamed yourself. Maybe I wasn't enough. Maybe I was too much. Maybe if I had just... You twist yourself into memories, trying to find the flaw that made them leave, as if your value is a puzzle you never solved. But here's the truth your heart forgets. Your worth was never theirs to give, and it was never theirs to take. You were whole before they arrived, even if you didn't know it. You had dreams, a laugh that didn't seek permission, a soul that didn't need approval to shine. They may have dimmed it, but they didn't create it. You're not broken because someone couldn't see you clearly. You're not unworthy because they chose distance over depth. Healing begins when you stop measuring yourself by someone else's inability to love you right. So tonight, as you lie with your doubts beside you, try whispering this. I was always worthy, even before the heartbreak, especially after. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Confusing loneliness with love. It's a quiet trap, this confusion we rarely see coming. Where the ache of emptiness starts to wear the costume of love. You miss their presence, yes. But do you miss them? or the silence they used to fill. There's a difference between missing someone who nourished your soul and missing the noise that distracted you from your own hunger. Loneliness is clever. It will whisper, "Wasn't it better than nothing?" It will convince you that a cold touch was warmer than no hand at all, that a distracted voice was better than the hum of your own thoughts. But love, real love, is not what you beg for in the hollow moments at night. It's not found in the shadow of absence or in the echoes of almost. Love doesn't just sit beside you. It sees you. It holds you, even when words run dry. Yet when we're lonely, we settle for the memory of being held, even if we were never truly seen. And so we call it love, when really we're just trying to not be alone. But solitude isn't a punishment. It's a soft space where you relearn the sound of your own voice, where you remember that your heart beats not for validation, but for the quiet miracle of simply being alive. So next time the loneliness comes, ask yourself, do I miss love? Or do I miss forgetting I was alone? Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Being more afraid of healing than of staying hurt. There's a strange comfort in the wounds we know. We walk with them, tuck them beneath our ribs, let them hum in the background like a song we don't even notice anymore. Because healing, real healing, isn't just about letting go of pain. It's about letting go of identity, of the story you told yourself to survive. You've worn your scars like armor, not proudly perhaps, but protectively. Because to move on means you must stop pointing back and saying, "That's why I hurt." And without that reason, who are you? Healing asks hard things of us. It demands we rewrite narratives, forgive what we never got apologies for, and sit with emotions we've spent years avoiding. Hurt is familiar. It has a rhythm. It justifies the walls you built, the numbness you've learned to live with. But healing? Healing is messy. It breaks the routine of self-blame, shines light in places you've kept hidden, and forces you to grieve not just the love that left, but the version of yourself that accepted less. Sometimes, staying hurt feels safer than walking into the unknown of who you could become without the pain. But listen closely. You are allowed to be whole. You are allowed to be soft again without being naive. You are allowed to live a life that isn't rooted in survival. So tonight, don't rush to heal. Just be willing to believe there's more waiting for you than what hurt you, and that your pain was never meant to be permanent. Now let's move on to the next chapter. The first lie you let slide. It was small, wasn't it? Just a twist of truth, a skipped detail, a moment where your gut clenched. But you smiled anyway. Because you wanted to believe them. Because confrontation felt heavier than silence. Because the truth, even hinted at, threatened to unravel the dream you were still clinging to. The first lie is rarely about the words themselves. It's about the choice you make in that fragile second between knowing and pretending not to. You tell yourself, they were just tired. Maybe I misunderstood. It's not a big deal, but it is. Because that first lie sets the rhythm. It marks the moment when you began to make yourself small in the name of love. When trust became an offering instead of a foundation. And once you excuse one untruth, the next ones come easier. Soothing, seductive, stacking gently into a house you won't realize is made of sand until it crumbles beneath your feet. But let's not blame you for wanting to believe. That's human. That's hope. That's the soft, aching heart trying to choose connection even when clarity whispers something's not right. Still, deep down, you knew. You always knew. And tonight, let's remember, love should never require that you lie to yourself just to keep it alive. Not even once. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. When they mocked your pain. There are few moments more hollow than when you offer your wounds to someone and they laugh. Not always out loud, sometimes it's in a smirk, a sigh, a shrug that says, "You're too sensitive." You opened up, maybe for the first time in weeks or months or ever. You peeled back the silence and gave them something real, something tender, something still aching. And they didn't meet it with softness. They met it with discomfort, dismissal, disdain. It was like handing someone your heart only to watch them toss it in the air, not even caring where it lands. And in that moment, you learn to hide again. Because when your pain becomes a punchline, you begin to believe it deserves to be. You start questioning your reactions, downplaying your needs, masking your truth behind careful, measured words. If you speak at all. You learn that being vulnerable comes at a cost. And slowly, you trade honesty for survival. But what if I told you that your pain was never too much? That your tears were never excessive? That your voice was never a burden? What if I told you that the cruelty they showed was not a reflection of your softness, but of their inability to meet it? You deserve someone who holds your hurt with reverence, who listens not to fix, but to witness. Tonight, let that laughter fade. Let it echo out of you, into the nothing it always was. You are not foolish for feeling. You are radiant for still being able to. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The apology that never came. Some things stay with you. Not because they were too loud, but because they were never said at all. Like the apology you waited for. Through storms of silence, across endless rewrites in your mind, in all those moments where "I'm sorry" could have stitched something broken, but it never came. And so you filled in the blanks yourself. You told yourself it wasn't that bad. That maybe they didn't know they hurt you. That perhaps expecting accountability was asking for too much. But it wasn't. You were not wrong to crave acknowledgement, to want the ache named, to long for your pain to be seen and honored. Instead, you were met with deflection, the kind that makes you question your memory, your judgment, your worth. And over time, you stopped asking. Because asking started to feel like begging. The apology became a ghost, hovering between you and healing. Not loud, but present. Always present. It's the space in conversations you no longer have, the weight in your chest when you pass by familiar places, the quiet grief of knowing closure isn't coming from the one who broke you. But tonight, let's whisper something truer. You do not need their apology to begin again. Their silence does not define you. Your worth isn't tied to their remorse, and the peace you seek has always lived within you. Patient, waiting, like a sunrise behind storm clouds. Maybe the apology never came, but maybe tonight you can give yourself one. I'm sorry you were hurt. You deserved better. You still do. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. They laugh when you were crying. There is a peculiar kind of loneliness that settles in when you're crying in front of someone who doesn't care. Not just apathy, but amusement, a smirk at your trembling voice, a chuckle at your vulnerability, as if your breaking heart was something silly, something dramatic, something to be dismissed. You sat there, bare and unraveling, searching for comfort in their eyes, and found coldness instead. They didn't reach for you. They didn't hold space. They didn't even soften their gaze. Instead, they laughed, And in that laugh, you learned a brutal lesson. Not everyone is worthy of witnessing your softness. You started to swallow your grief, to cry quietly into your pillow, to wipe your tears before anyone saw. You began to equate love with suppression, to believe that feeling deeply was the problem, not the cruelty of those who refused to understand it. But what if that moment was never about your sensitivity? What if it revealed their lack of depth, their inability to hold space for anything real? Because real love doesn't laugh when you're in pain. It leans in. It listens. It doesn't mock your tears. It honors them. And tonight, as you lie here in the hush of midnight, let this truth wrap around you gently. Your tears were not wrong. Your pain was not exaggerated. And your heart, even when it cracked open in front of someone unworthy, was doing the bravest thing it knew how to do. Feel it all. Cry if you must. And know this time, you're finally safe to be seen. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The day you didn't feel safe. It wasn't loud. There were no fists, no doors slammed, no threats shouted across the room. But something in you shifted. Maybe it was a look, a silence that felt too sharp, a comment that pierced deeper than it should have. And suddenly, you didn't feel safe, not in the obvious, visible way, but in the quiet, invisible one. Not physically threatened, but emotionally endangered. Like being in a room where the air turns cold, but no one else notices. You began to watch what you said. You edited yourself mid-sentence. You weighed every word before speaking, as if your honesty might become a weapon used against you later. That day, you realized something essential was missing. The basic safety of being able to be yourself without fear. Safety isn't always about locks on doors. Sometimes, it's about whether someone makes your soul feel held. Do they protect your vulnerability? Or do they treat it like ammunition? Do you exhale in their presence? Or hold your breath, afraid to misstep? That day, the one you never talk about, was when your body knew. It remembered how to flinch, how to shrink, how to become small just to stay unseen. But you weren't meant to live like that. Love is not supposed to feel like a performance under threat. You deserve a connection where your truth is safe, where your fears are met with warmth, not ridicule. And tonight, as you lie here in stillness, you don't have to armor up. You're allowed to soften, to breathe deeply, to remember that safety, real safety, starts when you no longer fear your own truth. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The time they made you choose. It felt like a crossroads you never asked to stand at. One path led toward your friends, your family, your dreams, your sense of self. The other, straight into their arms, but at a cost. And you chose them. Not because you didn't care about the life you were leaving behind, but because you were made to believe that love demands sacrifice. That devotion means surrendering everything else that once mattered. Maybe it started small. They didn't like a friend of yours. They rolled their eyes when you mentioned your ambitions. They sighed when you stayed too long on the phone with your mother. And then came the question, unspoken, but heavy. If you really love me, why do you need anyone else? And so, piece by piece, you let parts of your world go. You stopped sharing your joys with those who used to know you best. You dimmed your laughter to avoid being accused of finding happiness elsewhere. But here's the thing. Love that isolates isn't love. It's control. You were never meant to choose between being whole and being wanted. The right love doesn't ask you to cut yourself in half just to fit inside its narrow expectations. And tonight, as you reflect in the hush of the dark, you can begin to call back the pieces you abandoned. You are allowed to belong to more than one world. You are allowed to be loyal to your own heart first, because the person worth choosing will never force you to leave yourself behind. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. How you doubted yourself for them. You used to trust your intuition, that quiet whisper that tugged gently at your chest when something felt off. But with them, doubt became a constant hum. You'd say something with certainty, only to hear, "You're overthinking." That never happened. Why are you so sensitive? And slowly, you began to question the most sacred voice you had, your own. You replayed conversations over and over, wondering if maybe you had misunderstood. Maybe you were being too emotional. Maybe the problem really was you. But that's the trap, isn't it? Gaslighting doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply erodes, not in earthquakes, but in a steady drip that wears away the stone of self-trust until even your reflection feels unfamiliar. You started apologizing for things you didn't do. You started checking their moods before expressing your truth. You began to ask for permission to feel what you felt. You doubted your memories, your instincts, your worth. And yet, deep down, you knew. You knew when something wasn't right. You knew when words didn't match actions. You knew when love began to feel like a test you were always failing. Tonight, let yourself return to the place of knowing. That quiet, sacred space that doesn't need to be proven to be real. You were never too much. You were never too broken. You were simply being asked to betray your own truth. And you chose, for a while, to survive. Now, you get to choose differently. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The way they compared you. It always started subtly, a casual remark. She never used to react like that. A lingering memory. My ex used to understand me better. A seemingly harmless joke. You should have seen how she dressed. And at first, you laughed it off, told yourself it didn't matter. They're just talking, right? Just sharing old stories. You're not supposed to feel threatened by a shadow. But comparison is a quiet poison. And when it comes from someone you love, it doesn't just hurt. It begins to redefine you. Suddenly you start watching yourself. Every response, every outfit, every silence. Trying to measure up to someone you've never even met. Someone who existed only through their lens, their nostalgia, their manipulation. You start changing. Not in ways that reflect growth, but in ways that reflect fear. Fear of not being enough. Fear of being replaced. Fear of losing a love you're already losing in pieces. They made you feel like love was a contest, and you were always coming in second. They made someone else's past the blueprint for your present. And without ever saying it outright, they convinced you that being you just wasn't good enough. But here's what they never told you. When someone truly sees you, they don't compare. They don't measure you against ghosts. They meet you fully, in your flaws, in your fire, in your quiet magic. Tonight, release the weight of someone else's memory sitting on your shoulders. You are not a replica. You are not a placeholder. You are not a revision of someone they lost or someone they long for. You are your own becoming, and that is more than enough. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. When you realized you were settling, it didn't come like a thunderclap. It didn't arrive with a slammed door or a broken promise. No. It crept in like fog through an open window. Software almost invisible, but heavy all the same. You were lying beside them one night, listening to the hush of the room, and a thought whispered so gently it almost sounded like a lullaby. This isn't what I hoped for. And suddenly, the pieces began to shift. You remembered how you used to dream, of love that felt alive, partnerships filled with laughter and understanding, a tenderness that didn't leave bruises even if they weren't on your skin. But here you were, shrinking, silencing, surviving, not thriving, not expanding, just managing. You started keeping count of all the things you let go of, the books you stopped reading because they said they were too emotional, the clothes you stopped wearing because they rolled their eyes, the hobbies, the friends, the voice you lost to keep the peace that never truly came. Settling doesn't always feel like defeat. Sometimes it feels like routine, like comfort laced with quiet desperation, like staying in a house with leaking walls because you've already memorized the drips. But the truth is, every time you told yourself, this is fine, when it wasn't, you carved away a piece of your spirit. You didn't fall out of love with them. You fell out of love with a version of yourself that tolerated less than you deserved. And that realization, however soft, however sad, is sacred. Because it's the beginning, not of endings, but of return. To you, to the life you paused, to the fire you dimmed, to the version of love that doesn't ask you to settle, but invites you to rise. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The moment you felt like a burden. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't even a cruel word. It was a glance, a sigh, a delay in their voice when you said, "Can I tell you something?" That hesitation was louder than anything they could have said. That moment, quiet, fleeting, tore through the walls you had built around your needs. You asked for space to feel, and they made it seem like you were asking too much. You shared a wound, and they acted like you were complaining. You cried, and they looked away. And suddenly, you felt heavy. Not because your emotions were too much, but because they treated them like they were. There was a time you believed love meant being soft together. Now, love had started to feel like performance. Like holding in your sadness so they wouldn't get annoyed. Like pretending you were okay because you were tired of hearing them say, "You're too sensitive." You became fluent in minimizing, in apologizing, in making yourself small just to keep their world comfortable. But that night, that moment, when you caught your reflection mid-sentence and realized you were bracing for rejection, for simply being human, you knew. You were not loved in your fullness. You were being tolerated in your quietest fragments. And that's the difference between love and control. Love welcomes your storms and stillness alike. Love listens when the words don't come easily. Love doesn't treat your heart like an inconvenience. You are not too much. You are just placed in hands too weak to hold you. And when you feel like a burden, pause. Remember, you are not here to be easier to carry. You are here to be fully known. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The day you stopped explaining. It didn't happen in a storm. It didn't come with a scream or a slammed door. It arrived like silence after a long rain. Quiet, clear, and absolutely certain. You stopped explaining. Not because you gave up, but because you had finally given enough. You had explained your boundaries, and they moved them like furniture. You had explained your tears, and they called them dramatic. You had explained your hopes, and they rolled their eyes like your dreams were a punchline. So you stopped, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. Because one day, your soul got tired of writing essays to people committed to misunderstanding your worth. You realized that people who care don't need a thesis to value your no, to respect your quiet, to honor your heart. That day, you didn't shrink. You didn't beg. You didn't draft another emotional monologue to justify why you deserve kindness. You simply chose peace over performance. And in that choice, you found a power that didn't need to shout. You found a truth that didn't need to convince. You found your voice again. Not the one you used to explain your pain, but the one that whispered, "You don't have to prove anything anymore." There is grace in letting go of conversations that only ever ended in self-doubt. There is beauty in the boundaries that don't come with a footnote. You are allowed to leave when the room no longer respects your presence. And maybe, for the first time, your silence felt like freedom. Now, let's move on to the next chapter, reclaiming the sound of your voice. There was a time when your voice felt like thunder, even in a whisper. Before they trained you to doubt your tone, to soften your truths, to second-guess the way you said anything at all. They didn't just quiet you, they distorted you. Until every sentence came with an apology, until every opinion was wrapped in disclaimers, until every "I feel" felt like a risk you had to earn the right to express. But your voice was never too much. It was never too loud, too soft, too emotional, too strange. It was you. And now, bit by trembling bit, you're remembering that sound. Maybe it came back as a journal entry, scratched in the dark. Maybe it was a single word you said aloud and didn't regret afterward. Maybe it came when you laughed without checking who was watching, or when you said no and didn't rush to soften the blow. That's how it begins. Not with a roar, but with a gentle unlearning of shame. You are not here to echo someone else's comfort. You are not here to swallow every storm just to keep the peace. You are here to speak what only you can say. With your cadence, your rhythm, your fragile, mighty truth. Reclaiming your voice is not about volume. It's about ownership. It's about speaking, even if your voice shakes. Especially when it shakes. Because silence may have kept you safe, but it never made you whole. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Choosing loneliness over confusion. There's a strange kind of ache that comes not from being alone, but from being lost inside togetherness. You were never really alone in that relationship, yet you always felt misunderstood, surrounded yet isolated, held but not heard, present but never quite seen. The confusion crept in slowly, disguised as compromise, dressed up as maturity, masked as love. But it wasn't love. It was the constant decoding of their moods, the emotional math of giving more than you got, the shrinking of your truth so theirs could fill the room. And you told yourself stories, that they didn't mean it, that love is hard, that this is just a phase. But deep down, you knew the truth lived in your gut, like a stone you couldn't swallow. So when you chose loneliness, it wasn't weakness. It was clarity. It was courage. It was an act of rebellion in a world that tells you any love is better than none. But you chose the quiet over the chaos, the solitude over the constant second-guessing. You chose the stillness that asked nothing of you except to finally be yourself. And yes, loneliness has sharp edges. But it also has clean lines. It doesn't gaslight you. It doesn't twist your heart into apologetic shapes. In this loneliness, you can breathe again. You can hear your own thoughts without interruption. You can rebuild the rhythm of your own becoming. And maybe one day, you'll meet someone who adds to your peace instead of subtracting it. But even if you don't, you've already chosen yourself. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. When you finally meant no. There's a turning point so small, so quiet, that the world around you barely notices. But your soul hears it like thunder, It's the moment when you say no, and this time you actually mean it. Not out of anger, not as a threat, not as a test to see if they'll come back, but from a place of deep knowing, a sacred refusal to abandon yourself again. For so long, your no was coated in guilt, followed by explanations, softening, the inevitable backpedal. You feared being difficult, feared being alone, feared being seen as cold, unkind, unloving. But what they never understood is that your silence was love. Your patience was love. Your endurance through the ache, that too was love. You bent until your spine ached trying to make love look easy when it never was. And still, they asked for more. But this time, something shifted. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't defend your reasons. You just said it. Firm, calm, complete. Number. Not because they did something unforgivable, but because you finally forgave yourself for staying past your breaking point. No. Because you now understand. Your peace is not a negotiation. Your needs are not too much. Your boundaries are not a burden. And yes, it hurts. It always does when you start choosing yourself after a lifetime of choosing others. But it's also holy. The kind of holy that doesn't need to be justified. Because sometimes a quiet no is the loudest declaration of self-love you'll ever speak. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Realizing you were never asking for too much. There's a lie that lodges itself deep in your chest when you've loved someone who couldn't love you back. The lie that says you were too much, too emotional, too sensitive, too needy, too intense. You start to believe that your desire to be heard, to be understood, to be held in your softness was unreasonable. But what if that was never true? What if all this time you weren't asking for too much, but simply asking the wrong person? You see, there's a quiet pain in always having to shrink your joy so theirs could feel bigger. A dull ache in hiding your fears so they wouldn't feel burdened. You wrapped your needs in apology, served them gently, only to be told you were difficult, dramatic, demanding. But those weren't demands. They were truths. Whispers from your inner child saying, please, hold me, see me, stay. And still, you were made to feel like the problem. But now, in the stillness that follows the storm, a softer truth begins to rise. You were never asking for fireworks, just presence, not grand gestures, but consistent kindness, not perfection, but honesty. To want warmth, reliability, emotional availability. These are not luxuries. They are the language of love spoken by hearts that are ready. And as you cradle this realization, the weight begins to lift. You were not too much. You were just enough. For the right kind of love. The kind that won't make you beg for the very things you so freely give. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The freedom of unsent texts. There's a strange, silent triumph in typing out a message and choosing not to send it. Your fingers hover. Your heart pounds. Because for so long, your worth felt tied to their response. A reply could lift your soul or shatter your sleep. And so, night after night, you wrote them your pain. You explained your silence. You begged without using the word please. But not anymore. Tonight, you still feel the urge to share one last thought, to remind them of who you were, to seek the validation they never truly gave. And yet, you breathe. You pause. You let the message rest unsent. Because this time, the silence is for you. Not a punishment, but a soft boundary. Not an act of spite, but an act of self-respect. The unsent text becomes a ritual of healing. A moment where your need to be understood meets your deeper need to finally walk away. You realize you don't have to defend your pain to someone who minimized it. You don't have to remind someone of your value if they never looked for it in the first place. The words stay locked in your phone, but your energy returns to you. And with every unsent message, you reclaim a piece of your power. Some truths are meant to be spoken, and some are meant to be sacred, kept only for the soul that endured them. Tonight, you don't press send, you press release. And in that stillness, you feel it. Freedom, soft and quiet as a sigh, unfolding within. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Detaching without revenge. There is a quieter kind of strength in walking away without burning bridges, not because they deserve peace, but because you do. You once imagined that healing would look like a grand reckoning, like truth erupting, like them finally realizing what they lost. You pictured the apology, the remorse, the moment they'd say, "I should have treated you better." But healing doesn't always come with an audience. Sometimes it arrives in the silence you stop fighting. Detaching without revenge is not weakness. It is wisdom. It is knowing that retaliation only keeps you tethered to what you're trying to escape. You can still feel angry. You can still grieve, ache, shiver in the memory of how it all fell apart. But you don't need to perform your pain. You don't need to prove it. Letting go without vengeance means releasing the cycle. No more keeping score. No more fantasizing about their regret. No more rewriting the past just to win a battle that already wounded you. You begin to realize you don't need them to hurt for you to heal. And that's where your peace lives. Not in justice delivered by them, but in the justice you offer yourself, by choosing to rise without dragging yourself through the mud of bitterness. Tonight, you close the chapter without a dramatic ending. Just a gentle breath, a quiet decision, an unannounced departure from a life that never made room for your joy. Let them wonder. You're already somewhere softer. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Building a self without permission. There comes a day when you stop asking the world to validate your becoming. When you no longer wait for a green light from someone who never saw your worth in the first place. When you realize that permission to grow, to dream, to evolve, was never theirs to give. You used to check yourself in their reflection. Is this version of me lovable enough? Am I too much or not enough? You edited your soul for palatability, shaping yourself around their comfort while your true self whispered, barely heard, beneath the noise. But now, something softer stirs in you. The quiet revolution of self-returning. You remember how you laughed before you learned to apologize for your joy. You recall the thrill of wanting something just because you wanted it. Not for approval, not for applause, just for the sweet taste of living. Building a self without permission means risking disapproval. From them, from society, from the outdated voices still echoing in your head. It means choosing your truth even when no one claps for it, even when they leave. It's rebuilding your house after the storm wrecked it. Not just to survive, but to make space for beauty again. It's learning the sound of your own yes, even when the world responds with silence. You begin to ask different questions. Not, do they accept me? But do I honor myself in this moment? Not, will they still love me if I change? But can I still love me if I stay the same? Tonight, you tuck yourself in with the comfort of self-approval. No signatures needed, no witnesses required. You are enough, on your own terms, at your own pace. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Loving without needing to be saved. There was a time when love meant rescue. A hand pulling you from the wreckage, a presence that made your silence bearable, a heartbeat louder than your fears. You weren't just seeking warmth, you were seeking escape. And in them, you saw a lifeboat, a fixer, a healer, a person who would rewrite your story and undo the ache that preceded them. You handed them your wounds like fragile glass, hoping they'd know how to hold you without shattering what was left. But love built on salvation is never steady. When they falter, because they will, you are left stranded again, blaming them for not being the cure to a pain they didn't cause. You don't need to be saved. You never did. That myth was planted early. In fairy tales, in broken childhoods, in the moments when no one came, and so you dreamed someone might. But loving without needing to be saved is an act of quiet revolution. It's showing up as your own anchor, your own lighthouse in the fog. It's choosing love, not because it completes you, but because it reflects the wholeness you're learning to hold within. It means wanting them, not for the way they fill your emptiness, but for the way they witness your fullness. Without trying to fix, without making your hurt about them, without needing to be the hero. Real love doesn't ask for surrender. It invites you to stay rooted in your own becoming, even as you reach toward another. So tonight, breathe deep. You are your own sanctuary, and love, true love, will meet you there. Not with answers, but with presence. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Healing without their apology. There's a silence more hollow than absence. The apology that never came. You waited for it, sometimes with clenched fists, sometimes with open arms. Sometimes you even rehearsed how they'd say it. The words they'd use, the look in their eyes, the weight that would lift the moment they finally understood what they had done. But some people don't apologize, not because they didn't hurt you, but because they cannot face the mirror of their own reflection. To say I was wrong would unravel too many threads they've tied into their identity. And so, they stay silent, or worse. They pretend nothing happened at all. Still, your healing does not depend on their remorse. It never did. The apology you truly need is your own, to the parts of you that stayed when they should have left, to the voice inside that whispered warnings you were taught to ignore, to the heart that kept breaking just to feel close. Offer it now, gently. Not out of blame, but out of recognition. You were doing the best you could with the love you thought you needed. You don't need their guilt to validate your grief. You don't need their confession to begin again. You are allowed to close the chapter without a final word. You are allowed to heal without permission. So tonight, if your mind reaches for closure, remind it. Closure doesn't come from them. It grows in the quiet space where you learn to sit with your pain and no longer ask it to leave. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Understanding it wasn't love. It's one of the hardest truths to cradle. That what you thought was love wasn't. Not the kind that nourishes. Not the kind that sees you fully. Not the kind that holds you in your darkest hour and still says, I'm here. No, this love was conditional. It asked for pieces of you, bit by bit, until there was hardly anything left to give. It celebrated your silence, punished your honesty, and offered affection only when it was convenient. But you called it love. Because that's what you were taught. Because that's what it looked like once. Maybe in a smile, a touch, a moment of closeness that felt like coming home, right before the door was slammed shut again. It's okay to grieve the idea more than the person, to mourn the hope, the dream, the Maybe one day. Because what you were truly seeking was never just their presence. It was connection, safety, a sense that you mattered. And those things should never be earned through pain. You didn't fail at love. You didn't ask for too much. You simply mistook intensity for intimacy, chaos for chemistry, scarcity for depth. Now, in the quiet after the storm, you're starting to see it clearly, not with anger, not even with resentment, but with a soft sadness, a whisper inside that says, I deserve something different. It wasn't love, not the kind you were born to feel, not the kind that heals. And now you know the difference. That knowing is the beginning of something beautiful. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Holding space for what you deserved. You deserved more than a love that made you question your worth. More than conversations where your voice dissolved into silence. More than apologies you whispered just to keep the peace. You deserved a love that didn't require shrinking, a love that held your joy like something sacred, not like something to be tolerated. Holding space for what you deserved means finally making room for the truth. That your needs were never a burden, your emotions never too much, your dreams never unrealistic. You were simply offering your heart to someone who didn't know how to hold it. And now it's your turn to hold it, to cradle every forgotten part of yourself, to say, I see you, I hear you, I won't abandon you again. You may have spent years negotiating for crumbs from a table you were meant to sit at fully. But now you are building your own table. No more waiting for permission. No more asking to be chosen. Holding space means slowing down when the ache rises unexpectedly. It means giving yourself the grace to not be okay sometimes. To miss them and still know they weren't right for you. To feel the pull of the past, but not let it dictate your direction. It's not about hating them. It's not about bitterness. It's about finally stepping into the light of your own self-worth and realizing you've been enough all along. Tonight, as you rest, let that space widen, not with regret, but with gentle possibility. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Loving yourself back from ruin. There comes a moment, often in silence, when you look in the mirror and realize you've been tending to everyone else's fire while letting your own burn out. Loving yourself back from ruin is not loud or sudden. It's not a victory parade or a movie climax. It's the slow, sacred work of returning to the parts of you that got buried beneath compromise, confusion, and chaos. You may not even know where to begin. But you begin anyway, by picking up the pieces one small choice at a time. Drinking water instead of texting them. Writing a journal entry instead of rereading old messages. Going outside for 5 minutes. Whispering, I'm still here to the mirror. You see, ruin isn't always destruction. Sometimes it's just silence. The hollow echo where joy used to live. The weight of pretending you were okay for longer than your soul could carry. But healing doesn't demand perfection. It asks for honesty and tenderness and patience. Loving yourself back means allowing the cracks to stay visible, not to shame yourself, but to honor the strength it took to survive. It's speaking gently to the parts of you that once accepted too little, that once mistook pain for passion, that stayed longer than you knew was safe. It's forgiving yourself not because what happened was okay, but because you're ready to stop carrying the guilt that was never yours to begin with. Tonight, let yourself fall asleep with a hand on your heart. Feel it beat. It's still yours. It's still strong. And it's still capable of the softest kind of love. The one you've needed all along. Your own. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. trusting again without fear. Trust. Such a fragile thing, isn't it? It breaks with whispers. It shatters with silence. It crumbles with promises spoken in half-truths. And after betrayal, even the gentlest hands can feel like weapons. Even kindness can feel suspicious. Even love can feel like a trap. You want to trust again, not just others, yourself. But the question circles like a ghost. What if I get hurt again? What if I'm wrong again? This fear isn't foolish. It comes from wounds that once bled quietly, from moments where your heart was open and someone walked through it with muddy feet. But trust is not about forgetting. It's about remembering wisely. You don't need to rush back into blind belief. You don't need to hand your heart over wrapped in ribbon. You can trust slowly now, intentionally. You can learn to trust your own intuition first. That quiet inner voice that you silenced to keep someone else comfortable. It begins with the smallest decisions. Choosing rest without guilt, saying no without explanation, setting boundaries not as walls, but as doors with locks you control. You are not naive for still believing in good. You are brave. Because trusting after pain requires more courage than never having been hurt at all. It's okay if your trust is cautious. Let it be earned, not demanded. Let it unfold, not be rushed. Tonight, breathe in this simple truth. You are not the same person who once broke. You are wiser. You are softer, yes, but stronger too. And you don't need to be fearless to trust again. You just need to be willing. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Sleeping without overthinking. The bed is supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where your body softens, your breath slows, and the noise of the day recedes like a distant tide. But for you, the bed became a battlefield. And the silence? It was never quiet. You lay there, eyes wide open, rewinding conversations that ended hours ago. Reliving every moment you wish you'd said more, or said less, or not said anything at all. You hold autopsies for words that didn't land right, for looks that lingered too long, for texts that never came back. Your brain so loud, your heart so tired, and still. You keep rehearsing the what-ifs and should-haves like they're lullabies. You tell yourself, if I just understand it better, maybe I won't feel this way. But understanding doesn't always bring peace. Sometimes it only feeds the storm. So here's a gentle thought to sleep beside. You don't need to figure it all out tonight. You don't need every answer just to allow your mind a moment of rest. It's okay to place the questions gently on your nightstand and return to them later, when the morning light is kinder. Breathe. Not for clarity, not for control, just to feel what it's like to exist without problem solving. Your thoughts are not emergencies. Your memories are not punishments. And your worth does not depend on your ability to understand why it all fell apart. You are allowed to rest, even if the past is unfinished, even if the future feels uncertain. Tonight, the most radical thing you can do is close your eyes and let go of the need to overthink just long enough to finally sleep. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Forgiving yourself for staying. You stayed. Longer than you wanted. Longer than they deserved. Longer than what was safe for your spirit. And now, you carry the weight of that choice like a quiet shame stitched into your skin. You replay every sign you ignored, every boundary you let erode, every time you silenced your own needs just to keep the peace that never really existed. And beneath all the anger, at them, at the world, lives something softer. A grief for the version of you who kept hoping, who kept believing, who stayed because she didn't yet know how to leave. But what if staying wasn't your failure? What if it was your way of surviving, of loving through confusion, of choosing comfort over collapse, of buying time until you were strong enough to walk away? The heart doesn't always know how to protect itself, especially when it's taught that love means endurance. So be gentle with your past self. She did the best she could with the tools she had. She was not weak, she was loyal, she was terrified, and she was brave in her own, quiet way. Forgiveness isn't a clean slate. It's a soft hand reaching back to hold the girl you used to be, the one who didn't know yet that love should never cost you yourself. Tonight, whisper this to your heart. I forgive you for staying. You were worthy of more, even before you believed it. And in that forgiveness, may you finally begin to feel free. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Releasing the dream that kept you bound. Sometimes, it's not the person you struggle to let go of. It's the dream. The idea of who they could have been. The life you imagined you'd share. The soft redemption arc you scripted in your head where they'd finally understand, finally change, finally love you the way you needed all along. But dreams can become cages too, especially the ones built from what-ifs and maybe one days. You hold on to them, thinking you're holding on to hope. But really, you're gripping a ghost, something that was never truly alive. It's strange, isn't it? How you can mourn something that never existed. The imaginary happiness. The future they promised with pretty words and empty hands. The moments you rehearsed in your mind to soothe the ache of reality. You didn't fall in love with who they were. You fell in love with who you believed they could be. If only they healed. If only they saw you. If only they tried. But they didn't. And that's not your failure. It's the truth you've been gently resisting. Because letting go of that dream feels like losing the last thread of meaning in the pain. But what if freedom lives on the other side of that release? What if the real love story is the one you begin after you stop waiting for theirs to rewrite itself? Tonight, let the dream unravel. Not with bitterness, but with mercy. You don't have to keep hoping for a different ending to a chapter that was never meant to save you. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Finding beauty in the lessons. There's something tender about looking back without flinching, about tracing the outline of your past, even the sharp, broken parts, and seeing not a mistake, but a message. Pain can be a cruel teacher, but it teaches. And when the ache softens, when your breath returns to a rhythm that doesn't tremble, you begin to see it wasn't all for nothing. Even the love that wounded you left behind a trail of wisdom stitched into your soul. You learned how to listen, not just to words, but to silences. How to recognize what love feels like and what it doesn't. You learned that your intuition was not an inconvenience, but a quiet guardian trying to lead you home. You now know that your needs are not too much, your tears are not too loud, and your dreams are not unrealistic. You know what it feels like to give too much of yourself, and what it costs when you do. But you also learned how to come back, to pick up the scattered pieces, not to rebuild what was, but to create something wiser, softer, truer. There's beauty in that kind of growth, the kind that blooms through cracks, the kind you earn with every scar, the kind that whispers, I survived, and I understood. So tonight, as your eyes begin to close, let gratitude wrap around your grief. You walked through fire and came out more luminous than ever. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Seeing red flags as warnings, not challenges. There was a time when red flags looked like puzzles, challenges, tests of how deeply you could love someone, how much you could endure, how well you could prove that your love was stronger than their chaos. You saw inconsistency and thought, maybe I can stabilize them. You saw distance and thought, maybe I can pull them closer. You saw cruelty and thought, maybe if I love them enough, they'll soften. But red flags are not invitations. They are signals. Signals from your soul, from the wisdom within you that already knows. This is not love. This is not safe. This is not yours to fix. You're not here to carry someone else's storm at the cost of your sunshine. You're not meant to mistake emotional labor for emotional connection, and you're certainly not meant to turn survival into romance. Now, with gentler eyes and stronger boundaries, you begin to see things clearly. You notice how often love was conditional, how many times you were made to shrink, how often your softness was used against you. And now, you don't lean in when someone pushes you away. You don't explain yourself to those committed to misunderstanding you. You don't water dead gardens. Red flags no longer spark your curiosity. They stir your clarity. And that's a sacred shift. Let that be a quiet vow tonight. You will honor the signs next time. Not because you're bitter, but because you finally know your worth. Now let's move on to the next chapter. Falling asleep knowing you're free. There is a hush that only comes when you finally let go. A stillness that wraps around your chest where once there was only tightness, only the ache of what you clung to. Tonight, that silence feels different. Not empty, not hollow, but sacred. Like exhaling after holding your breath for far too long. Like hearing your own heartbeat and realizing you're still here, and you're safe now. No more nights spent rehearsing what you could have said. No more tossing in bed, wondering if they ever truly loved you. No more sacrificing sleep for the illusion of closeness. You no longer wait for the message that won't come. You no longer carry the guilt that was never yours to begin with. You no longer shrink in the presence of someone who made you feel too much. Freedom doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes as the decision not to reach out. Sometimes it looks like deleting a number or smiling at yourself in the mirror with a softness that says, I came back home to me. And in this moment, under this sky, you are not waiting, not yearning, not breaking. You are simply being. You are whole in your own presence. And for the first time in a long time, you don't need a hand to hold to fall asleep. You have your own. So let yourself rest, not because the world is perfect, but because you are no longer trying to fix what was never yours to repair. Let your eyelids fall. Let your breath deepen. Let peace be the final word tonight. You are free, and that is enough. Then let this be the first of many. Subscribe for more poetic sleep journeys that hold your heart the way it always deserved. Share this video with someone who needs to know they're not alone. And turn on the bell, so the next time you can't sleep, you'll have a voice waiting to guide you gently home. Thank you for letting me be part of your healing. Now rest. You've earned it. Twilight?